Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my nonconformist capricious parents always did things exceedingly differently. That was the way they were. So when they bought an abandoned property in the Blue Ridge Mountains in October of 2013, it didn't come as a big surprise to me. They always acted impulsively and did idiosyncratic off-the-cuff things without giving them too much thought about the ramifications of some of their choices. My impetuous father always believed that in life you needed to make decisions promptly, as otherwise the opportunity might abandon you like a balloon on the wind and fly away. He had learnt that growing up to his disadvantage when his ambiguous parents failed to make any prompt decisions in regards to his own life. They had missed out on buying a phenomenal home once because his father had dilly-dallied about whether to put an offer in on the place or not, so in the end they'd brought a much more mediocre home. Another time his parents had vacillated about what holiday destination to choose. They dithered so much in finalising their arrangements, so in the end they had to settle for a less than adequate holiday that still had available bookings that ended up being less than satisfactory, with inadequate accommodation, abysmal service, poor food, and bed bugs in the bed. My father never forgot the ambivalence of his parents. It cost his family much in his young life. So now he had his favourite saying, which was, if you snooze, you lose. The thing that disturbed me the most about the property we had purchased was that no one knew what had happened to the previous owners, as by all accounts they'd fled the property, were registered as missing, presumed dead as far as I can gather. They had never even accessed even their bank accounts, or been in touch with any family members. I mean, how do 4 people vanish off the face of the earth just like that, without so much as a trace? It does leave you pondering as to what on earth could have happened to them. The 1870 property was auctioned by the bank and was in a dreadful state of disrepair. Luckily the roof was still in good condition, which was its only saving grace, but many of the structural walls were crumbling, while the wooden windows had warped, twisted and buckled, and the floorboards had become badly damaged. The haunting property still contained the previous owner's furniture, that was once grandiose for its time, but now stuck in a 1970s time warp. Many of the upholstered furnishings were now threadbare. A family of mice were happily nesting in the confines of the settee. The once beautiful Persian rugs had been completely devoured by insatiable carpet moths. The place was caked with dust that was so thick you could write your name in it. Then there were mouse droppings, insect skeletons, and cobwebs everywhere. The most haunting thing of all was that the dining room table was still set for what must have been their last supper, as if something quite dreadful must have happened while they were eating their dinner. Dried up butternut squash appeared to be on their dinner plates, which gave me a horrible chill down my spine. What had happened that night to this poor innocent family? Whatever it was, it must have been quite terrible, I thought. I had discovered some airy photographs of the family lying around the place. They looked like decent people, a mother, a father, a boy and a girl, of similar ages to me and my sister Janice, between the ages of 11 and 13. But apart from a few fleeting photographs, some comic books and an old game of snakes and ladders, we knew nothing about the mysterious family that had previously lived in our home. We were exceedingly fortunate, if you can look at it from that perspective, that the property went for a song. My father snapped it up as quickly as possible. He was a master builder who'd built many wealthy people their dream home, from start to finish in all parts of America, from California to New York, Atlanta and Boston. So as a family we'd moved around a lot, as he was in building construction. He was determined to build us the quintessential asymmetrical contemporary modern home that we all hankered for, and so that is what he did. The kind with seamless finishes, a flat roof and extensive large living areas with huge floor-to-ceiling windows. My father was determined to make the house blend seamlessly into the environment, with a focus on maximising the panoramic views of the breathtaking countryside, which included the undulating contours of the mountains that dappled the distant horizon in a magnificent purple smoky haze. Then there were the verdant rolling hills, the pretty flowery meadows, the sculptural rocky outcrops, the enchanting silvery pond that was lavishly bespeckled with water lilies and teeming with frogs and fish. And last but not least, the viridescent forest that consisted primarily of maples and oak trees, which was teeming with an abundance of wildlife and a thriving deer population. Of course, my parents wanted to add all the extra niceties to the building project that had become much more recently fashionable, and of course added to the value and prestige of our home, rather like a dressing room for my mother, with a walk-in wardrobe and a stylish open-plan kitchen fitted with top-of-the-range kitchen units and granite surfaces, and of course sliding doors that opened out onto a sprawling entertainment area. The property was located on 40 acres of overgrown rambling brush. Grotesque, ugly-looking weeds and creeping variegated vines had spiralled their way through the old driveway and around the house, transforming the yard into a dense jungle and rambunctious thicket. So my father had to hire a landscape gardener to transform the yard. Let's just say it was a mammoth project, and the landscape gardener had to make a plethora of trips to the dump, as there was so much yard waste. At first glance I was absolutely furious that my dad had bought such a sinister-looking property that just looked creepy and oppressive. It was hard for me to see the potential of something as hideously ugly as this vacant home. It truly looked like a derelict haunted location, hardly the kind of property I'd be pleased to call home. Also, knowing that something dreadful may have happened to the previous occupants did nothing to dull my deep cynicism about my father's impulsive purchase. While the building was in progress, we stayed in a trailer on the premises. There were many times I cursed the very day my father had taken on such a long-suffering building project. I think we all felt the same way. I assure you there's nothing more tedious than waking up every morning to the sounds of workmen knocking away and hammering at chipboard, while you live a cramped life cooped up in a trailer. It was hard for me to see my father's vision for the place. All I could see was a huge mess and an overgrown jungle. But I'm glad to say, to my father's credit, he had a great vision, as we saw the old dilapidated building beginning to take on some pleasing shapes. When parts of the old house were in the throes of being demolished, we noticed other details about the house that we'd previously overlooked. There were some deep, angry gashes that could be seen all over the wooden panels of the house, almost as if someone had deliberately tried to vandalize the place. There were several windows that had been broken through and heavily boarded up from the inside out by the previous owners, almost as if they'd been trying to keep something out. Even crazier were the inside doors that were bolted up like Fort Knox with double locks. There were metal-barred security gates erected on the inside of every bedroom. The kitchen back door and the front door as well. I don't know why we'd overlooked these minor details that didn't seem so minor at all in the grand overall scheme of things. Whoever had owned this house had gone to extreme lengths in regards to their stringent security measures, which seemed excessive for an idyllic location like the Blue Ridge Mountains. Something must have freaked the family out so significantly, for whatever it was, I hoped and prayed that it wouldn't come after us. On the 25th of February 2014, we'd finally moved into our beautiful new home and were no longer residing in the trailer. But it was on March the 3rd, 2014, when our area was hit with the most terrible heavy snow, sleet and frozen rain. and areas around our home like Oklahoma, New Jersey and Virginia were hit really badly. There were major problems in the Blue Ridge Mountain area and the Shenandoah Valley, including the Richmond area, as well as Interstates 81 and 64. So we were very badly affected by the extreme weather and suffered the ravages of sub-zero conditions, so our family was pretty much snowed in. The house was very warm. My mother busied herself making warming meals for us, and there was a crackling fire blazing away in the living room, keeping the house snug and cosy. I remember it was a bitterly cold winter's day, but as the yard had recently been renovated and completely cleared out, me and my sister Janice had discovered a lovely hilly slope at the far end of our property that was large enough for tobogganing. Despite the horrendous, harrowing weather conditions, we really wanted to try out our hand on the hilly slope. My mother wasn't keen on the idea. She suggested that there would be many other times in the future when the conditions would be less chaotic than they were now, when we could go tobogganing on the hill. But after much begging, she finally agreed, as long as my father would keep a watch over us. Me and Janice wasted no time in racing outdoors, warmly dressed in our anoraks, woolly hats, scarves and boots. I still remember how dreadfully cold it was. I could feel the icy sleet numbing my face. I knew my mother was right. These conditions were very crazy for tobogganing. My fingers, even inside my gloves, felt like icicles. But I wasn't going to return indoors with my tail between my legs, admitting that my mother was right. I was adventurous, always had been, and I was hardly going to let the bad weather stop me from having fun. Before long, Janice and I were enjoying ourselves going up and down the hilly slope on our toboggans. We felt exhilarated. Suddenly on my downward ride, I hit something hard that was sticking out of the snow and went flying in the air like a frisbee, finally landing on the soft snow in the lower valley beneath us. I'm glad to say that all that was wounded was my pride. I had landed in a crumpled heap at the bottom of the slope. My father was watching us with a look of amusement. I think he found my fall rather funny. He wasted no time in rushing up the hilly slope to investigate what it was that had tripped me up on my downhill ride. We discovered the end of a long pole of some kind jutting out of the hilly outcrop through to the exposed snow. We were curious to find out what it was. My father thought it was some kind of marker. He got his trowels out from the shed and proceeded to dig around the large pole. He dug away large layers of snow and dirt. We found ourselves faced with the most god-awful stench of such I do not have words in my vocabulary to describe. The undeniable smell of decaying flesh hit our nostrils hard. Whatever we were smelling must have been dead for quite a while. Suddenly my father's trowel hit a large hairy hand. I heard him say, "What the heck is this?" He continued to dig until the body of a large hairy monster was revealed. The creature looked mummified, but it was in remarkably good condition to be able to see very clearly, despite having been dead for so long and smelling deplorable. This strange, hideous, humanoid-looking beast, whatever in God's name it actually was covered all over its body from top to bottom with thick, dark brown hair, apart from the hairless face. The head was an unusual dome shape. It was literally attached to these humongous, rounded shoulders. The human-like face looked like it was weathered and old, because the protruding forehead was filled with deep, dense furrows. The skin was thickly textured like a rhino hide. The dead eyes stared up at us vacantly. They were a dark brown colour. But why were the eyes not empty sockets after all this time? Surely they should have been eaten by worms. None of this made any sense to us at all. The nose was so flat and squashed, it reminded me of a pug. The lips were thin, but when you pushed the lips back like I did with a piece of a twig, I could tell the creature had large teeth that were like humans, only much, much bigger. It was peculiar because the creature appeared mummified, solid like stone. But maybe it hadn't been there long. We couldn't be sure. The whole thing was an enigmatic mystery that left us with more questions than answers. However, the thing that had me and my father in total awe was the size of this monstrous beast. It was titanic in its proportions, even in death. It was giant-like. My father said he must be about 9 foot tall, and easily about 800 pounds or even more. The creature was solid, stocky and muscular, with exceedingly long arms and human-like hands and feet, with smooth nail beds. Bear in mind we'd never heard of a Bigfoot before, But one thing for certain, this creature looked half human and half ape. We were certain it was some kind of primate. We found the whole body was riddled with bullets from top to bottom, as if someone had been using him for target practice. However, it didn't take much for us to realise that it could have been the previous owner of the property that may have been the one who had killed this creature, which may well have terrorised him and his family. We could see, if it was alive, it would have been an apex predator, and certainly a formidable foe. Maybe this creature was the reason why the previous owners had gone to such lengths to secure their property and board up their windows. We couldn't be sure. But surely if it had been buried for so long, the body would have decayed. Instead, it seemed mummified. My father thought it might have something to do with the dryness and acidity of the soil that had prevented the body from decomposing, and that seemed like a plausible explanation to me. My father was dumbfounded by what we were seeing. As far as we could see, this creature was not known by science. My father felt we should notify the authorities about this strange animal that we'd found. We believed we had discovered an unidentified species, and also this formidable-looking creature could unravel the mystery of the family that had disappeared from this location. Well, so we thought. I heard my father on the telephone telling the police what we'd found, and then we were put through to the sheriff. To cut a long story short, the next thing we knew, a black van drove up our drive and asked us to show them the body of the strange creature. We noticed 2 men in black suits got out of the van. Within seconds they placed the dead creature in a body bag, then on a gurney, and popped it in the back of the van, and proceeded to hurriedly drive down our drive, even in those treacherous conditions, like a bat out of hell. It all happened so fast that we just went with the flow. We didn't ask any awkward questions. Another dark car arrived 5 minutes later. 2 military men, heavily armed with large rifles, went to investigate the wooded area on our property. They did a thorough search, seemed fully satisfied, sped away in the truck as fast as they'd come. It was all rather mysterious, I thought. Were they looking for more of these anomalous creatures, I wondered. The following day my father phoned the police to ask whether the unusual, outlandish creature that we had discovered had been identified. We were told it was a misidentification on our parts. The creature we had found was a bear. My father was furious about being fobbed off like that. He knew the creature we'd seen was definitely not a bear. "I think there's some weird kind of cover-up going on," he said. "I want to get to the bottom of it." I remember my father made some phone calls to find out what was going on. One day a very smart, opulent-looking limousine drove down our driveway at one hell of a speed. 2 small men in tight suits with dark glasses that were too big for their faces got out of the car. I was standing in the doorway. They asked me if they could speak to my father at once. The men were standoffish, rude. Their tones were abrasive and curt, very businesslike, I thought. I noticed the skin on their faces was hauntingly white, so white that it didn't look natural or even human. They both sat on the edges of the upholstered chairs in our living room, and my father said they seemed hostile, cold, and very unfriendly. The one man said to my father, "We understand, Mr. Donahue, that you are causing a great deal of problems, asking all kind of awkward questions, stirring up a lot of discord. That's not a very nice thing to be doing, is it, Mr. Donahue? No one likes to have their feathers ruffled, do they? If you must know, I'm only trying to find out why there's a cover-up going on. I keep being told the creature we found in the snow was a bear. I assure you it was no bear. It had hands, it didn't have paws." "Mr. Donahue," said one of the men, "if you open your mouth about what you saw, there will be big trouble. You think the people that lived in this house of yours disappeared by accident? There are no accidents in this world, Mr. Donahue. But there are arranged accidents when people fail to comply with the rules. Then those people get eliminated. We wouldn't like that to happen to your lovely little family, would we? I see you have a very nice little daughter out there. I'm sure you would like her to have a good, long life. One day get married, have children of her own. I'm sure you're looking forward to being grandparents one day. You wouldn't want anything to jeopardize that for you, would you? Are you threatening me? my father asked, his back stiffening. "Now, who said anything about threatening you, Mr. Donahue? No one is threatening you. We're only telling you what you already know. The creature you found in the snow that was taken away was a bear. We do not want you to go spreading around unlikely rumours, do we, Mr. Donahue?" "So you want me to pretend the creature I saw was a bear?" "Mr. Donahue, I'd like to make things very clear to you. The creature you found buried on the hilly slope was a bear. We would appreciate it greatly if you didn't discuss the matter further. Or the next time we visit you, things won't be so rosy. We'll see ourselves out now. Good day to you, Mr. Donahue." My father watched the men leaving, his face drained of colour. I could see he was trembling. "Is everything all right?" my mother asked. She looked at my father with a perturbed expression on her face. "You look as if you've seen a ghost, sweetheart. What did those men want with you? They seemed terribly official, rather like government agents." "I don't know who they are, but I would appreciate it if we never talk about the strange creature we found in the ice any more. I think it's safe to say it was a bear." "But it wasn't a bear," said my mother. My father virtually growled at my mother. "It was a bear," he insisted. One day I happened to bring up the subject again about the quirky creature we had uncovered that freezing winter's day. My father told us we were never to mention the subject ever again, under any circumstances, nor tell anybody what we'd seen. It was a year later, in March of 2017, we had an outlandish visitor to our home. He was a small man under 5 foot tall, with a square jawline and piercing brown eyes that were so sharp like a fearsome bird of prey. He asked if he could see my parents. My father ushered him into the kitchen, offering him a cup of coffee. He refused and asked for a mug of warm milk instead. "I won't beat around the bush," he said, "but it came to my attention that last year on your premises you discovered the deceased body of a Sasquatch that was later taken away by the authorities, who have asked you to brush the secret under the carpet. Am I right about this or not?" "Sorry, who are you?" asked my father, looking awkward. I could tell he was becoming nervous, passing my mother surreptitious sideways glances. "It doesn't matter who I am. Is this story true or not?" "No," said my father. "I do not know where you heard such outrageous claims. We did find the body on a hill a year ago, but I assure you it was only a bear. We never found a Sasquatch. I'm not even sure such an anomalous creature even exists here in North America." The man drank down his milk, leaving a rim of white froth around his dark moustache. "Very good. That's what I needed to hear. You saw a bear. Don't you ever forget that it was a bear." And then he was gone like that. "You see what I mean?" said my father. "I repeat, we must never talk about the strange creature we found buried on that hill. Someone out there is watching us. They're making sure we keep our mouths shut. They mean business." Fast forward to 2018, 4 years after our discovery of the strange hairy creature buried in our yard. I remember it was a gloriously warm, sunny day. I was lying on a towel on the grass next to my sister Janice. We were lying at the edge of the woodgrove on our lawn, which was always superbly mowed by my father. I suddenly had this horrible feeling that I was being studied by a pair of keen, curious eyes. But as I looked around our yard, I could see nothing there. "I think something's watching us," I told my sister Janice, but she looked up and glanced towards the trees and said there was nothing there, that I was imagining things, but I knew I wasn't. I could tell something was spying on us. I thought it might be the kids from next-door neighbour's property, as on many occasions we had spotted them playing in our woodgrove. My father turned a blind eye to it. He was good friends with their father. "I think it's one of the neighbourhood kids," I whispered. I was half expecting to hear some boyish giggles or to find ourselves being suddenly sprayed by water pistols, but everything was serene and peaceful, yet I still felt as if I was being studied. But I pushed aside those nagging thoughts. I told myself I was just being silly. "Are you hungry?" I asked my sister, opening the picnic basket my mother had packed for us. I pulled out a Tupperware container of sandwiches, handed my sister a ham and pickle sandwich. We began to eat our sandwiches and talk. Then my sister said, "I think you're right. Something is watching us. Over there, behind that tree. I'm sure I saw a movement." "Where?" I asked my sister. "Over there, to the right." "That's a tree stump," I told her. But then the tree stump moved. My sister was right. I adjusted my eyes to the light. I could see a pair of treacle-brown eyes staring at us from about 7 feet off the ground. Then we saw her. I think she wanted us to see her. She was no longer attempting to hide from us. She was definitely female, not only because of her breasts, but her feminine energy as well. I was amazed that she was almost identical to the creature we'd found buried in the snow 4 years earlier. I couldn't help wondering if she was related to it in any way. The creature was similar to the one we'd found, only she would have been a lot smaller, weighed half as much, but she was still very big. I hasten to say that the creature seemed amused by the way I was eating my sandwich. She started to mimic me. She was a brilliant actress. She pretended to be eating a sandwich. I stood there staring at her in awe. I thought she seemed like a gentle soul. Not once did she threaten me or my sister, or give us any cause to feel afraid. She stared at us with brown congenial eyes that looked comical. Then she scratched her head thoughtfully for a moment. After a while she vanished like a ghost. We were disappointed that she had gone. We had enjoyed our interaction with her. Of course we told my parents what we'd seen. My father was visibly upset. "I don't want you to speak of these creatures to anyone. No one must know what you've seen. We don't want trouble coming our way." One day the neighbour's mother popped around to her house unexpectedly, which was a turn-up for the books. She's a lovely lady called Sheila, but shy, self-effacing and reticent, so my mother was surprised to see her. She'd invited Sheila to her home on numerous occasions before, but she'd always politely declined all our invitations. We knew her to be quite reclusive. Everyone accepted in town that she was a hermit. My mother had met her only once before, and on seeing Sheila at our front door, was really rather bewildered. She said that the woman seemed nervous and on edge, so she offered Sheila a chair in our kitchen. "I must apologise for my kids always playing in your woodgrove," she said. "I hope they're not too much of a nuisance." "They're welcome to play there," said my mother, "any time. Your woods are spectacular." "Well, they are pretty special," my mother agreed. "Sometimes I take our dogs there for a walk. It's lovely in there, so peaceful. A sanctuary, especially in summer." The woman paused. She twiddled her fingers awkwardly. Her lips tightened. "You do know you have a Bigfoot living in your woodgrove?" "Oh," said my mother, raising a brow. "Don't look worried. She's a gentle giant. My children found her nesting area recently, the place where she sleeps." "Oh," said my mother, not knowing what else to say. "Well, that's the reason why I'm here, really. I'm worried about the welfare of the Bigfoot. I know she might look intimidating and scary, but I'd hate something bad to happen to her. I'm looking out for her interests, you see. I'd hate your husband to kill her." "Well, why would he do that?" my mother asked. Because people do crazy things when they're scared. I worry if your husband was to see her, he might feel the need to shoot her, based on how large she is. But I want to assure you she's a benign creature. She would never harm us. In truth, we're a lot safer out there with her watching over us. Much safer, actually." "Well, that's an interesting way to look at it," my mother said. "Well, you may be wondering why I keep myself to myself. I'm very reclusive, I admit, and I'm sorry that I have declined many of your invitations over the years. I know it may seem awfully rude of me, but it's nothing personal, I assure you. Of course, some people have taken offence to my rejections. I wish they wouldn't." "I realise that," said my mother. "I knew you must have your reasons for being so private." Sheila looked grateful. "I'm glad you see it like that. You're a very perceptive woman." "I haven't got agoraphobia. It's not as bad as that. But I do have a nervous condition brought on by post-traumatic stress that has kept me a prisoner in my own home. I'm fortunate to be married to Miles. He's a very understanding, loving man. You may have noticed he does all the shopping, takes the kids to school for me and church, so that I can stay safely at home." "May I ask you what happened to bring about your post-traumatic stress disorder? Of course, if you don't want to tell me, I'll fully understand." "I was raped, attacked by a strange man when I was about 22 years old. I was taking a shortcut to my home through a heavily wooded area. This young man pounced on me from behind the bushes. He had dark hair and a long bushy black beard. I think he was round about my age. I remember he smelt of body odour. His bedraggled clothes suggested to me that he slept rough. His breath reeked of booze. It was the most terrifying thing that has ever happened to me. 1 minute you're walking peacefully in the woods, the next minute someone is on top of you, holding you at knife point and telling you to shut up or they'll kill you. My mother gasped, cupping her hands over her mouth. How horrifying! I don't know what to say. It could have been a lot worse. The young man could have killed me, but he didn't get the chance. She lowered her voice into a quiet whisper. I was saved by a Sasquatch. You mean a Bigfoot saved you? Well, I was fighting for my life as the man was raping me. I was screaming. Suddenly a big black creature appeared through the bushes, lifted the man off me. He ripped off this man's head, throwing it across the forest floor like a soccer ball. I was stunned. The creature was so kind. She was also female, very protective towards me. She knew at once that the man who had attacked me had meant to harm me. I quickly got dressed as most of my clothes had been ripped off by him. That Bigfoot escorted me through the woods. I never saw her again, but I never ever forgot her kindness. You don't forget it when something saves your life like that. Do you think the man would have killed you? My mother asked. I don't know. It's possible. I remember looking into his eyes when he was attacking me. He looked so soulless. Maybe he would have killed me to cover up his iniquitous secret. I don't know. It's something that haunts me to this day. Did you report the incident to the police? My mother asked. No. Are you mad? Of course I didn't. I was 22 years old at the time. I felt incredibly ashamed, embarrassed, humiliated even, as if it was all my fault. When you're that age, you can be very secretive and very self-conscious. I have no idea who the rapist was, but I do know his dismembered body was found in the woods. I will say this, I felt no empathy for him. He was a monster with a heart of stone. No one who does that is a human. And you've lived with the secret for so long? Sheila nodded, the tears pouring down her face like raindrops. My husband knows the story, of course. Naturally, he's thrilled the monster that attacked me is dead. We both have a soft spot for Sasquatch and the circumstances. I know there are stories out there that are horrendous, but my experience of these creatures has been favourable. You must excuse my impertinence, but don't you think you should have some kind of trauma counselling in the circumstances? That way you might have more confidence to live a normal life, to get out more, even go on holiday perhaps with your husband and kids. My husband's been begging me to have trauma counselling for years. It is something I am considering. It's a great idea. It must get awfully lonely for you tucked away in your home like that. If you need a friend, I'd be more than happy to come around and visit you. You would? Of course, said my mother, squeezing Sheila's hand tightly. Going back to the Bigfoot in the woods, you don't want to worry about that. I understand why you're so protective of her. My children encountered her one day when they were sunbathing and eating sandwiches. They saw a female Bigfoot copying them eating their sandwiches, but she was very evasive. That's her. I saw her once gliding past my window. We had a moment when our eyes met. She reminded me of the Bigfoot that saved me. I feel so much safer knowing she's out there, but you don't want my husband to shoot her. That's right. I can't help worrying about that. I have sleepless nights about it. You've nothing to worry about, Sheila, I assure you. My husband would never just kill an innocent creature for no reason at all. There'd have to be a good reason before he literally shot something. To cut a long story short, we still keep our mouths zipped about the creature we found frozen in ice. To this day, we don't know why the previous owners vanished from our home. The good news is that Sheila is receiving counselling. Over the last couple of years, she and my mother have grown very close. As for the Bigfoot female, she does have a male partner now. On occasion, we have spotted them both in our woodgrove. I believe Sheila's right. Those creatures are benign. They're watching our back, and they are no threat to us at all. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. I was lying in my sumptuously cosy single bed, comfortably fast asleep in the shabby, somewhat unkempt apartment that I shared with my best friend Hilda. My waitressing clothes from the previous night smelt strongly of cigarette fumes, gleaned from the customers at the restaurant.
and were tossed haphazardly across the faded wing chair in the corner of my bedroom. I wasn't exactly the most tidy person in the entire world, but it was difficult to be the house-proud type when I was living in such a dump. It was impossible, in my humble opinion, to make a silk purse out of a sow's ear, although, believe me, we had tried to fix things. We had used our feeble attempts to put pictures, pot plants with tumbling leaves, and to even pick out pieces of affordable, trendy furniture to make the place seem like a home. Furniture that we'd got cheap from tirelessly surfing all the thrift stores to find that perfect second-hand bargain. But despite our industrious efforts to put our stamp on the place, it remained steadfastly unbecoming, rather like a wilted flower in a vase that simply refuses to be revived. The apartment block in Hudson Yard where we lived was situated on the west side of Manhattan, bounded by 30th Street on the south and 41st Street to the north. The area was fast becoming the cultural centre and global template for other cities to follow. It was just too bad there was nothing modern or becoming about this development, which somehow appeared to be caught in a 1970s time warp. It was a grey, sombre concrete affair, a square-shaped building, with little patios overlooking the street. The outside walls were made of this morbidly charmless, bubbling cement. Whoever designed this ugly, unprepossessing place certainly lacked imagination, and was obviously looking to erect something rather functional. It was just too bad that there was nothing modern or becoming about the entire development, which was caught up in a glib 1970s time warp. It was a grey, sombre concrete affair, a square-shaped building, with patios that overlooked the street. The outside textured walls were made of this morbidly charmless, bubbling cement. Whoever designed this ugly, unprepossessing creation certainly lacked imagination, and was obviously looking to erect something functional that blatantly disregarded the aesthetics of the place. The entire building was bleak, mundane, oppressively depressing, especially like that of an overcast day. So our miniature-sized kitchenette boasted rather outdated chipboard cupboards that were barely hanging on to their hinges, a scratched stainless steel sink that was forever getting blocked, backsplashes of the most ugly-coloured olive green tiles that were permanently chipped with crumbling grout. Then there were the cheap olive green linoleum floors, and we had an olive green bathroom suite that had been in fashion in 1972. The apartment was not pretty, but as far as me and Hilda were concerned, it was at the very least a roof over our heads, and was what we could only just afford, as living in New York was incredibly expensive, as anyone will tell you who lives there. The block of flats in Hudson Yard was fast becoming the local eyesore, like the cactus growing among the roses, that any self-respecting gardener would definitely remove. The locals in our area would walk past our ungainly block of flats, tightly closing their eyes so that they could do their best to avoid looking at the place. It probably spoilt the view for them, rudely defacing the landscape. I even noticed that many dog walkers would surreptitiously urge their dogs to lift up a leg on the magnolia tree parked outside the block of flats, registering their disgust that this big, ungainly apartment block dared to even have the audacity and insolent discourteousness to exist. I'm sure people were clandestinely thinking, what is this atrocity doing here in our neighbourhood, as it was so out of place, like a sardine swimming among a school of bright, beautiful angelfish, because it did not belong here. There were, of course, wild rumours and lots of speculation that a wrecking ball was on its way, ready to bring down the whole block of blemished flats to its knees, whether Mr. Spinley liked it or not, which would be a cause for great celebration for people living in Hudson Yard. I was sure that much joy would ensue when the ugly monstrosity was finally gone, and obliterated from the memories of so many who had viewed her with the same measure of wanton disgust as I did every single night on my return to the apartment block after my waitressing shift, where I worked downtown, serving people burgers and chips, steak with huge wizen glasses filled with exotic craft beers, from a vast collection of choices on offer to the more discerning of palates. For me and Hilda, of course, If our apartment was reduced to a pile of rubble, it would mean finding another cheap place to rent, within our very slim budget, which was not something either one of us relished doing. I was sure the rumours about our building being demolished were not true, just winkful. More recently I'd noticed Mr. Spindley's impassive-looking rather grey face had looked a little more animated and pinker than usual, almost as if a spark of good news had gracefully come his way. Even his bird-shaped beaked nose had been twitching a little like a mouse that had found a surprising stash of cheese that he never saw coming. Recently, when I'd paid our monthly rent, I told Mr. Spindley that our loo was getting blocked and making a horrible groaning sound at night. He promptly said to me, "You girls are always tirelessly complaining about everything. Be grateful you've got a loo at all. I charge you very little rent to live here. You better enjoy the ridiculously cheap costs while it lasts." It would seem his ominous words gave me pause for reflection. Had I seen a smirk on his face? I couldn't be sure. Might there be some truth to the airborne rumours flying around the place from the residents living here? Word on the wind was that Mr. Spindley was indeed selling this place, to be bulldozed to make way for some grand apartment that would cost an absolute fortune to rent, and would be way beyond our affordability. By all accounts, me and Hilda would never have chosen to live in a downtrodden apartment like this, if we had the advantage of choice. But when your grim pockets are empty of free-flowing cash, choice becomes a luxury you can ill afford. The bodeful place where we lived was in a bad state of repair, thanks to Mr. Spindley, whom always conveniently overlooked the peeling paint on our walls, the cracks in the ceiling, the grotesque mould growing up on the bathroom tiles, and the windows with warped wooden panels that were beginning to crumble, and I struggled to get them open, for they were forever jamming. I always wondered how Mr. Spindley got away with doing absolutely nothing to the place. Wasn't it against the law for a landlord not to maintain the building for his tenants? If that was not glib enough, the whole block of flats we resided in had recently had an infestation of rats, thanks to one of the selfish, rather lazy residents, leaving piles of his overflowing black bin liners bursting at the seams, smelling disgusting, outside the front door of his apartment. He was too lackadaisical to bother taking them down to the dump, which would mean taking several staircases or a rather wobbly, unreliable lift to the ground floor. The apathetic man had invited the rats over to our apartment block with open arms, as I'm sure they fully appreciated some of the leftovers from his Chinese takeouts and pizzas he ordered. It was rumoured he ordered takeout from 5 local restaurants in the area every single night. Mr. Spindley told me the tenant, whom I'd never seen before a single day in my life, based on the fact that he'd been hibernating in his apartment for years on end like a mole, and was, I believe, a £600 man called Dave. I suspect he didn't have the physical fitness to undertake the hefty, gruelling job of removing his own trash. Me and Hilda, to make things a little more pleasant and bearable in our apartment block, and to thwart the infestation of rats taking up residence in the building, had taken it upon ourselves to dispose of his rubbish on his behalf. I had woken up one night to feel something scratching my face, and I screamed out in horror as this black rat crawled out of my bed sheets. It began to study me through its dark eyes. When I screamed, it hurriedly scurried to the half-open window, where it scrambled out and possibly made its way to the line of overfilled bins on the street, to scramble around, I imagine, for some scraps. I had screamed out so loud that my next-door neighbour, old Mr. Barnaby, had arrived at our door with a pickaxe in his hand, ready to exterminate anything that imposed a threat to me. When I told him it had only been a rat that had trespassed into our abode, he almost looked disappointed. I think he rather fancied decapitating something with his axe, although who or what I could not imagine. "All that fuss about a rat," he said, crinkling a brow. "Young lady, with a scream like that, I thought you'd been murdered." "I don't like rats," I said, puckering up my face in disgust. "They're filthy, dirty creatures that live in gutters and sewers, and they spread disease. We certainly don't need them in our apartment block. It ran out of my bed, Mr. Barnaby. I mean, what was it doing there? I'm sorry if I screamed like that, but thanks all the same for being a hero and coming to my rescue." but I'm sure I just had a bit of a shock. I'll be fine." "Well, that's a relief then," he said, looking me up and down with a degree of sympathy on his face. I expect he thought my being scared of a rat was a tad pathetic. Maybe he was right, but can you blame me for being scared when the thing practically crawled out of my bed? Who wants to have rats setting up home in their apartment, let alone in the sanctuary of your own bed? I know I certainly didn't. I secretly longed to escape the forlorn, miserable apartment block where I resided with my friend, but that seemed like a dream way beyond my grasp. For me, my life was like a footprint set in cement. It didn't look like it was about to change any time soon. Hilda and I would have loved to dump our apartment like a hot potato, but we were anchored here indefinitely to this ugly mooring site due to the rent being blissfully cheap. The two of us had one claim to fame. We were both college dropouts, with the potential to make much of our lives, but we shared one thing in common. We had let our parents badly down, along with ourselves, of course, in the process, although the latter neither of us would care to admit. At that stage of my life, I didn't want to accept the fact that I had catastrophically let myself down, based on some of the bad choices I had chosen to make, that I genuinely regretted. I certainly wished I'd applied myself at college more, but my immaturity had failed to appreciate the consequences of choosing not to focus on my studies. I had hoped to become a doctor one day, but that was never ever going to happen. I wondered how long could I wait tables for. Certainly I didn't fancy being a waitress indefinitely for the rest of my life. My parents, more to the point my draconian mother, that I secretly suspected breathed out fire from her lungs when no one was looking, had expected far too much from me when I was a young girl. I had grown up in a perfect red-bricked home in Queens. You know the type. We lived in an idyllic green leafy neighbourhood, and to all intents and purposes, had it not been for my mother breathing down fire and brimstone over me, I could have had an idyllically enviable childhood. I was naturally expected to get high grades when I was at school, but it had been due to my mother's strict homework schedules and unreasonable taxing demands that I had felt I had no choice but to succeed. Over the years I resented my mother for laying on the pressure so thick that sometimes it became insufferably claustrophobic, so much so that I felt that I couldn't breathe. As a result, it was not uncommon for me to have panic attacks from a very young age. I remember returning home one day when I was in 5th grade, with a report card in hand that was so disappointing that my mother did not speak to me for 2 whole weeks, and her indifference towards me had devastated me. As a girl, I longed for my parents' approval, which was natural for any child, I imagine. For my mother to tell me that she loved me and was proud of me, but that never ever happened. My mother was emotionally distant, very withdrawn, and magnanimous displays of affection were reserved for our big fat ginger cat, Tommy, whom my mother doted on. Sometimes I dreamed of being Tommy, so I would get my mother's undivided attention. I mean, who do you know that is jealous of their household tabby? But believe me, I was. My mother masterfully used sulking as a malleable, manipulative tool to get her message across loud and clear. She would pout, drop her eyes, avoid all eye contact with me, almost as if looking at me was too disgusting for words, and simply revulsed her. "I'm bitterly disappointed in you, Iris. Really I am," she would say coldly, looking at me as if she was about to burst into tears, which made me feel terribly bad, as if I'd whacked her across the head with a baseball bat, as my mother knew how to turn on the guilt like a tap of stingingly cold water. "No daughter of mine should bring shame on me like this," she would say disdainfully. "Your grades, Iris, have so cruelly humiliated me. Do you realize how insulting this is for me to have a girl that appears to be stupid? Do I deserve any of this? All that I've done for you. It's quite appalling," she would glare. "I expect a lot from you, Iris. For God's sake, you're an intelligent girl, but the problem is you're too damn lazy to actually apply yourself. All the teachers are saying in your recent report cards, Iris could do better. She's a very bright student, but sometimes she daydreams in class. Me and your father are paying big money, Iris, for you to go to that private school, to receive the best education that I hope will open doors for you in the future, to really make something of yourself and your life. You are selfishly throwing all our good intentions back at us. Iris, these reports are an absolute joke, she would say, throwing my report card across the floor in disgust, after she'd torn it up, of course. I'm appalled and ashamed of you, Iris, really, really ashamed. No daughter of mine should treat me like this. There are no words to describe my disappointment in you. Daydreaming in class is simply unacceptable. Why the hell are you not listening to what the teachers are teaching you? What is wrong with you? What do you think I pay all that money for? If you want to be a doctor one day, my girl, you better pull your socks up quickly, or it's never going to happen. I'm sorry, Mum. It just gets boring at school sometimes, that's all, I said shamefacedly. In that moment my mother's eyes burned with a raged indignation. She looked like she was about to throttle me. Instead, she marched out of the room in her high-heeled shoes, slapping the ground with her stiletto heels to express her frustration. She turned around in the middle of the doorway and looked at me through narrowing eyes and said warningly, "If I ever get a report card like that again, Iris dear, I'll have you hung, drawn and quartered. Do you understand? And I don't say that lightly, my girl. I mean every word of it." In that moment I had been so scared of my mother's dire warnings that from thenceforth I applied myself at school, as if I had a loaded gun placed at my temple, which would go off if I had the brazen audacity to fail at anything. I was now getting top grades, but even when I succeeded, it was never good enough for my mother, who quickly pointed out that I could still have done better and got a distinction or something like that. So I was always a perennial disappointment to her. My mother was a capriciously moody person, cantankerously truculent, you could say, when you didn't do things her way, which meant for me 24/7 that I had to work my butt off. My father was a likeable, very lovable character, infinitely more easygoing and approachable than my mother was. He was relatively nonchalant about my grades, as in his opinion it wasn't the end of the world if I didn't get great grades at school and did a little daydreaming in class. As far as he was concerned, that was a forgivable offence. I mean, after all, he'd done it himself back in his day. The trouble was my father was like putty in my mother's hands, so what she said always stood, although he did try to make her see sense from time to time, with very little to no success. "Sweetheart," he would say to her, "don't you think you're being a wee little unreasonable with Iris? She's worked incredibly hard, got excellent grades. Why are you complaining about them? Goodness gracious, she didn't have to get a distinction. She got an A. Isn't that good enough for you? Should you not congratulate her for her successes?" My mother practically would spit at my father in disgust. "Congratulate her? Are you joking? I'll congratulate Iris when she deserves to be congratulated. I'm very disappointed that she didn't get a distinction." My father had promptly shut up, retracting straight back to his shell, like a reticent tortoise, only to emerge again when my mother had significantly calmed down. He knew better than to challenge her. If he did stand up to her, life might not have been worth living, and my father didn't like upsetting my mother. My father would say to me, "I'm very sorry, Iris. You know what your mother's like. She's difficult to please at times. Believe me, I know firsthand. I've been trying to please her all my life, but I've never succeeded. So don't take her criticism badly. Your mother is a perfectionist. I mean, look around you," he said, waving his arms around the living room. "Is there anything out of place in this living space? A little dust on the coffee table, perhaps? A smear on one of the glass panes on the windows? I don't think so." "No, there isn't," I agreed. "Everything looks fastidious, like what you'd see in a magazine catalogue." "Well, there you go then, love. That's your mother for you. Everything has to be so-so with her. When you accept that, you will understand that your mother is just very pedantic." I knew it was true. as every single thing I owned had to be neatly put away or my mother would have a coronary. She hated mess as much as a carnivore hates vegetables. Maybe that was why, since I'd left home, I had become rebelliously messy, as if to put a finger up to my mother. In some way it gave me a remote sense of satisfaction. "Why do you put up with her, Dad?" I'd asked him one day. "How can you stand to live like this with Mum, breathing down your neck all the time, giving you hell if you don't do things her way?" My father, who'd been sitting comfortably on the sumptuous sofa in the living room, reading a Dick Francis novel as a form of escapism. He loved his detective novels, and had bookshelves loaded with Agatha Christie's and other notable authors that enjoyed writing fictional crime drama. My father promptly removed his spectacles that accentuated his blue eyes, with gunmetal rounded steel frames that made him look like an owl. He looked at me sorrowfully. "You want to know why I put up with your mother and her shenanigans, Iris?" he asked me. "You really want to know the answer to that question?" I nodded wryly, half expecting my father to say that the only reason he dared to stay in his miserable marriage with my domineering, bullish mother was because of me, to give me the quintessential stable upbringing a child deserved. But he never said that. It turned out that my father's so-called miserable life was not miserable to him, as I suspected it was. Indeed, he was very contented with his lot in life, and this startling revelation really opened my eyes in bewilderment. How could anyone possibly be happy living with my mother? I mean, how could he be attracted to her, and even remotely like her? My father's loyalty towards her was an enigmatic conundrum to me that I could make no sense of. "Iris," he said gingerly, "contrary to what you may believe, your mother is not a monster. She loves and cares for you very much. She wants you to succeed in life. That's why she's so hard on you with your grades. I admit your mother goes way too overboard. As far as I'm concerned, you're entitled to have fun. After all, you're young, so you should let your hair down once in a while. Unfortunately, your mother sees things very differently to me. She thinks being tough on you is in your very best interests, like a master sculptor knocking away at the marble until he produces a fabulous masterpiece, even if that marble takes some beating. She believes that parents are not meant to befriend their kids, that we're here to guide you on your way to adulthood, so to speak." I scowled at my father's disregarding his words. What was he smoking? My mother didn't care about me at all. She only cared about how bad it looked if my grades didn't glow like the polished mahogany furniture in our own home. My mother was the kind of woman that wanted to boast about the successes of her progeny when she was at the country club playing tennis with her girlfriends or having sandwiches on the lawn with them. She was the type that wanted to gloat about the fact that her daughter was so much more successful than anybody else's daughter. But after I flunked college, I had failed her miserably, and I doubted she'd ever forgive me for that. "You didn't answer my question, Dad. Not really. You skirted around it. I want to know the truth. How do you really feel about Mum?" My father drew in a deep breath. He let out a heavy sigh. "You want to know why I put up with your mother's shenanigans, Iris?" He said this with a twinkle in his eyes. "Because I love the bones of her, that's why. It's as simple and straightforward as that. In the end, it boils down to love. And love, Iris, is a very funny thing." "What?" I had said, my mouth almost dropping open. "Say that again, Dad." "What do you want me to say, Iris? That I don't love your mother? It would be so much easier for me if I didn't, but I'm afraid I love her very much. You and your mother are my entire world, and nothing will ever change that for me. Yes, your mother is cantankerous, difficult, moody, obnoxious, incorrigible. She's all those things. Believe me, I know that too well. I'm aware of it all, but I'm still crazy in love with her." I had never understood how my father loved my mother so much. It made no sense to me at all, until I figured out how uniquely different everybody is, and what floats one man's boat won't float another man's boat. The saying beauty is in the eye of the beholder is definitely true. Show a man an image of an attractive woman, and you'll get a plethora of different reactions and responses. I did this once as an experiment while waitressing tables where I work, and showing some of our regulars a photograph of a woman who looked like an attractive model, blonde hair, brown eyes, you know the kind of thing. In truth, I was expecting men's reactions to all be the same. She's a stunner, but they did not. She's pretty, one man said. Not my type, said another. Another looked at the photograph with an expression of disdain on his face. She looks as hard as nails to me. I couldn't stand a woman like that. If I saw her, I'd run to the opposite side of the street. She's obviously high maintenance. I mean, look at those fingernails of hers. And that hair. That must have cost a fortune at the salon. One thing is for sure, she'd wipe out your money like a hive of hornets. I'd never expected so many multifaceted reactions from people. My customers were not remotely afraid to tell me the truth of what they really thought, which I really appreciated, for had they been strangers, they might have said what they were socially expected to say. She's a very attractive woman. I realised that despite social media platforms and its powerful influence over our lives and how we should think, not to mention the influences of our high-tech society and all this artificial intelligence we've been exposed to, that has malleably tried to inform us on what we're supposed to find beautiful, has not entirely worked, which in my opinion is a very good thing. For if we found the same people attractive, it could be problematic. It would seem we have our own individualistic ideas, styles and tastes of what we find beautiful and worthy of our love, attention and even sacrifice. I'll give you a great example of this. There's a man who was living in our apartment block. His name was Dick Dawkins. He probably earned a low income like the rest of us did. But he made the most of living in a dump because he turned his apartment into a meticulous flat, so that it really was stunningly refurbished. He didn't spare any expense on his projects. I went there for a drink once, and the apartment was beautiful. It was repainted, a brand new kitchen and bathroom had been fitted. I happened to know from Dick himself that the man had bought 5 sofas in the space of a year, because his big hunky dog Leningrad, that looked like a mix between a Great Dane and something else, chewed all his sofas up. Dick came home from work to discover that the whole apartment looked like a bloody crime scene. It was covered with the innards and entrails of his sofa, lying precariously over everything. I asked him, "Why do you put up with your dog's outrageous behaviour?" And like my father, with a merry twinkle in his eyes, he said, "I love the bones off that dog. If he chewed up 100 sofas, I wouldn't give a damn. The sofas you can replace. The dog you simply cannot." One day Leningrad was rushed to the vet for a medical emergency. It turned out he'd swallowed a plastic dinosaur that the dog found impossible to pass. The vet bill was extortionate, but Dick, with his slim earnings, took out a loan to pay for the dog's operation. In the end, Dick got a companion for Leningrad in another dog, so that he wasn't left alone to eat up more sofas during the day. But beyond that, he hired a dog walker to take Leningrad and his new companion for regular walks while he was at work. My point is, Dick would do anything for Leningrad, and loved him despite of his imperfections. That was when I realized that love is idiosyncratic and complex. Some of us may love the most cantankerous, rather difficult people for reasons we cannot explain. But I was not one of those people when it came to my mother, who had always rubbed me up the wrong way. When I was at high school, I dreamed of the day that I would leave for college, like a bird in a cage might wistfully fantasize of a day when it's able to fly, stretching out its wings, sailing the ocean of the skies with a magisterial grace. I yearned for that free bird to be me. The trouble was, when I left for college and my parents were paying for my education and student's digs, this newfound independence I embraced like a heady drug. I blew all caution to the wind and rebelliously lived like a frivolous wild mare, galloping around the wilderness, doing the hell what I wanted and stuff what anyone thought about it. I no longer had my annoying mother breathing down my neck like the proverbial dragon. I could feel the rebel in me emerging like a butterfly, weaving its way out of a cocoon, experiencing a rebirth of sorts, a rebellious one, of course. I wantonly abandoned the incarcerating chains of my old life. All I wanted to do was to party, party and party. I'd sometimes drink way too much, even though I didn't enjoy drinking. and occasionally enjoyed a spliff with friends. Let me tell you, due to my mother's stringent authoritarian approach to raising me, when I was out of my parents' house, my intractable behaviour got incorrigibly untoward. I found myself constantly failing to turn up for any of my lectures, so naturally I began to flunk everything. My mother had had enough when she realised that I was failing to apply myself, and was recklessly overindulging in a free-fall lifestyle, so she immediately drew her nails in. She quite literally spat me out of the family home, as if I was a detestable piece of chewing gum, and told me from now on I was on my own. She was done paying for college, and had drawn a line in the sand. I knew when I saw the cold, hard, unforgiving expression on her face that there was no coming around from this, and my insouciance towards my college lectures had come back to bite me, and in that moment I regretted all the parting I'd done, because I did not want to be a bum all my life, and without a degree, what hope did I have of making anything of myself? "After all I've done for you, Iris," my mother shrieked objectionably, rather like a banshee, "you repay me by failing like this. You brought shame on this family, Iris. I hope you're proud of yourself. What on earth will people think when they hear that my daughter, has flunked college? It's so humiliating. That is what it is. Mrs. Peterson's 2 daughters are well on their way to getting degrees in science and math, I believe. And oh, you! I just can't bear to look at you, Iris. You are a bitter disappointment to me. I've had enough of you. Enough, do you hear me?" she said, throwing her arms up in exasperation. "I knew the moment you left home, Iris, that you would come apart at the seams without me helping you out. Oh, I can't believe it. I so wish I was wrong about you. But you know what your problem is, Iris? You're so bone lazy. If it weren't for me, you'd have never succeeded at school. But I'm not paying for you any more. I'm just not. You flunked college, and you're going to go out into the big bad world yourself now, and make a go of things all on your own, without our financial support. Then see how easy it is. Me and your father, we've washed our hands of you from now on. And I mean that in a biblical way, Iris." For a moment my mother gave me a delighted retaliatory smirk. "You're going to realise, Iris dear, that it is not pretty out there by any manner of means, when you actually have to fend for yourself to make a living, which is what you're going to have to do from now on without our help. I hope you will begin to appreciate, Iris dear, what me and your father have done for you over the years, which you have clearly taken for granted. I want you to get your things now and go. I'm giving you 30 minutes to get the hell out of our home, and I don't want to see you again. I am bitterly disappointed in you, and don't you dare come back to our home begging for any help, if everything goes sour for you. You brought this on yourself, my girl, so don't expect to receive our pity." "But where will I go?" I protested, tears spilling down my cheeks. "Mum, you can't just throw me out like this. That's not fair. I'm still your daughter. I'm sorry. I messed up. I admit it. But give me a second chance. Let me retake college, and this time I will make you proud," I said, looking contrite. "I'm sorry, Iris. It's too late to redeem yourself now. There are no second chances in my household. You made a joke of college, drinking and partying away all the time. I can't forgive you for that. You need to grow up, Iris. You need to learn to be self-sufficient. It's exactly what you need. Sometimes the hard lessons in life will knock some sense into you, make something out of you. When I was a girl, I didn't have the advantage of college on my side. My parents couldn't afford it. But I had more grit and steel than you have in your tiny little finger. I wasn't afforded the privileges you were given, but you threw them right back in my face, and I cannot accept that, not for a moment." My impassionate mother stood outside my bedroom, her face cold, hard, and unyielding. She watched me fill 2 forlorn, pathetic, rather battered-looking suitcases with my worldly possessions, which I crammed in tightly. Once I'd packed my cases, my red-faced father took me to one side privately when my mother wasn't looking. He generously slipped $2,000 into my hands, looking ruefully apologetic. In a low, chagrined voice, he told me he was sure my mother would come around eventually. "You know what your mother's like, Iris," he said compunctiously. "She's devastated you flunked college. She's taken it rather hard, but give her time, love, and I'm sure she'll come round, and then you can come back home," he said. When I left the house, I tried to call my mother on numerous occasions to make amends with her, but she brazenly blocked my number, and for a mother to do that to her own child shows how absolutely furious she was with me. I guessed she would be sulking about my wayward insubordination, and her resentment would likely last not just for weeks or months, but possibly go into years. I knew she'd never ever forgive me for disappointing her so much, because I'd rarely let her down. It was when I began waitressing tables that I met Hilda. We became the very best of friends, as her lamentable story was not dissimilar to my own. She had also flunked her grades in college, and had bitterly disillusioned her parochial parents, who were dogmatically uncompromising and intolerant towards her failings, and had contemptuously tossed her out of their home, along with the dirty bathwater, saying they never wanted to see her again. I think my friendship with Hilda had been born from sharing the melancholia of a common predicament, where our bigoted mothers had chosen to refuse us forgiveness or an opportunity to redeem ourselves. Ostensibly, we had succeeded in being college dropouts that had offended and disgraced our mothers. This seemed to solidify the bond that was between the two of us, so we became close, both of us commiserating with each other for the unfortunate state of affairs that we were both facing. I think we both regretted making such a mess of things, but it was far too late for us to be crying over spilt milk. "They're supposed to love us unconditionally, our parents," Hilda vented. "We messed up, yes we did, but they should be forgiving us, should they not? And at the very least give us a second chance. I mean, we're young. We're inclined to make mistakes. It happens. Big deal." "Forgiving?" I said in a mock laugh. "Are you kidding me, Hilda? My toffee-nosed, insular, narrow-minded mother will never forgive me." So there Hilda was this morning, at a very disagreeable hour, ruthlessly tugging the sheets off my bed in order to get me to wake up. I could see through half-open eyes, a crack in the shabby curtains, that there was a dim light glinting through the bedroom, suggesting it wasn't even 5 in the morning yet. What on earth was Hilda doing? She knew well enough that I needed my beauty sleep. Why would she not respect that? I certainly didn't want to be getting up at this crazy, uncongenial hour. I had enough late nights on my repertoire, working as a waitress to all hours of the night. Hilda was the free-spirited, nonconformist type. Everything about her was bohemian and avant-garde. She loved to surf the second-hand clothes stores for clothes from the 60s, 70s, and even 80s. She didn't dress like regular folk, and shunned modern fashion trends and traditions, much like the punk rockers did in the early 80s, which I always admired. She liked to rebel on the dictates of our modern society by being controversially different, but she always looked stunning, no matter what she wore, and was in her way a bit of a trendsetter. Without even really knowing it, people would walk past her in the street. They'd give her an approving, rather curious second glance. She had feminine-looking flowery tattoos on her arms that made her look like she was wearing long sleeves in a lacy fabric. The trouble with Hilda was that she could become excitable and rambunctious, like a Jack Russell Terrier, when it gets its teeth into a fluffy toy that you cannot pull away from it unless you embrace a tug-of-war. This morning Hilda was like that. I could pick up the feverish excitement in the air as she tried to raise me from my slumber, which I suspect was a little like resurrecting the dead. "Wake up, lazy bones! Get up!" she said, shaking me vigorously. "I've brewed us some coffee in the kitchen. Get up!" "What time is it?" I groaned obsequiously, wishing that my annoying friend would just go away, leave me alone, and let me sleep in peace. "It's 5:10, said Hilda stubbornly. "Now are you going to get up, or do I need to throw a bucket of ice-cold water over your face?" "Hilda, I don't know what your problem is, But I don't want to get up now. I'm tired. Can't you see it? I just need to sleep in. Please, just leave me alone. I'll talk to you later. Just leave me be, will you? All right, said Hilda firmly. I'm going to get that bucket of ice-cold water right now. It was the threat of the ice-cold water being flung across my face that finally made me agree to get up. All right, don't do it. I'm getting up. I knew that Hilda did not dish out idle threats lightly. If she was suggesting she would throw ice-cold water over me, then there was only one guarantee. It would almost certainly happen. I reluctantly climbed out of bed with bleary eyes, groaning under my breath and muttering about how bitterly unfair it was to be woken up so unreasonably early like this. Hilda promptly escorted me by dragging me by the hand to our tiny kitchenette, which was not big enough to even swing a cat. Before I knew it, she was pushing me down on a seat at the breakfast nook, which was an ancient relic from the early 70s, and some of the stuffing was bursting through the open leather. Hilda thrust a mug of steaming coffee in my hand. Then, like Mary Poppins, she slid her body into the seat opposite mine, grinning at me with such a wide, sunny smile. It was obtrusively blinding at this early hour of the morning. I almost had to raise my hands to block out the glare. I could do well without this frisky, high-energy enthusiasm at this early hour of the morning, when I was still trying to find my bearings, after having been discourteously thrown out of bed by Hilda. "So what do you think?" asked Hilda excitedly. "What do you think, Iris?" "Think about what?" I asked in a grumble, warming my hands on the coffee cup and taking a sip. The stimulating effects of the caffeine seemed to pep me up a little. "About Sandra Benjamin's talk last night, silly. Wasn't it incredible? They say she's a millionaire many times over. She's only 25 years old. She lives in incredible style. She has a helipad on her vast property. She owns a Tesla, a Rolls-Royce, a Bentley, and a Jaguar. She wears the most stunning designer clothes. She owns 2 silky Afghan hounds. She goes to all these incredible locations on her holidays, frequented by the rich and famous, like the Hamptons in New York, Carmel by the sea, Cannes in France, and Aspen for her skiing holidays. She's a self-made millionaire, Iris. She has absolutely everything that money could possibly buy. She lives like a prima donna at such a young age. Can you imagine?" I know, I grumbled. "I was there last night with you, wasn't I, at the talk? I heard it all, during her long, self-indulgent, boastful spiel last night, which was way over the top if you ask me. She was flaunting it all, as if she was all that. 'Hello, everybody, look at me. Aren't I so wonderful?' I don't appreciate people like that, Hilda. They think they're superior to everybody else, because they made it big, because they're so wealthy. Big deal, if you ask me." "Didn't you hear what she said, Iris? Or were you not listening?" asked Hilda accusingly. "You weren't, were you?" she sighed. "So typical of you. I bet you thought the woman was talking bull, but I promise you she wasn't, Iris. She said if we project to the universe exactly what we want, we can have it. Like if you visualize driving and owning a Tesla car. It simply has to come into your life. But we're not allowed to doubt. Don't you see what this means, Iris? We can change our lives in Harry Potter style, without even waving a magic wand. And the magic wand in question is our minds, Iris, is our visualization, our ability to imagine. Iris, we can get out of this dreadful dump, move somewhere beautiful, imagine it," she said, her eyes dancing in excitement. "I'd love to tell Mr. Spindley to go and suck eggs, and that we're done with this crappy apartment of his, and his pathetic excuses as to why he won't fix the block toilet, or exterminate the rats in this building. Do you know I found some rat droppings on the dustbin here in the kitchen the other day? The problem with the rats is getting way out of control. I think we should go to Health and Safety and report Mr. Spindley. The problem's getting out of hand." "That's a very silly idea, Hilda, and you know it. If that happens, this whole building will be closed down and we'll be kicked out. And then where will we go?" I groaned. Much as I loved Hilda, her insufferable optimism about Sandra Benjamin and her unorthodox approach to changing your life was making me nauseously sick to my stomach. I certainly didn't buy into this nonsense for even a moment. If it was so easy, everybody in the world would be buying a yacht in Monaco, or sipping champagne cocktails in the Caribbean. Look, Hilda, I hate to burst your bubble. You might have been impressed by Sandra Benjamin's talk, but I was not. Everything she acquired was just by luck, and by knowing the right people and having the right contacts. It really is as simple as that. Besides anything else, she grew up in a privileged lifestyle. She went to the best schools that money could buy. She didn't care to mention that, did she, in her speech? How very convenient, if you ask me. Her father is a self-made millionaire, so it's blindingly obvious things are much more accessible to people like her than to most people. She's one of those annoying people that touches everything apart from the food that she eats, and it turns to gold. She got lucky, that's all. She was born to privilege. Now she's putting it all down to some kind of masterful projection. That's exactly what she wants you to believe, Hilda, I said scathingly. I'm sure any multi-billionaire is going to say the very same thing. Oh, believe yourself rich, and your world will transform before your very eyes, becoming like one of those machines in a casino that regurgitates money. Meanwhile, to follow my advice, buy all my books and my podcasts so that I get much richer in the process. I'm telling you, Hilda, it doesn't work like this. When I was living at home under my mother's stringent rules, I promise you, I would endlessly visualize leaving home and buying a stunning apartment somewhere and having a perfect paying job as a successful doctor. I imagined myself living by the beach somewhere, a carefree lifestyle, but it never happened for me, never. And believe me, I did visualize everything hundreds of times over, but it never happened. But maybe you weren't projecting properly, Hilda insisted. You were doing it all wrong. We are going to do some meditating and visualizing together. It's going to be fun. If we make it a joint exercise, for a start we can imagine leaving this horrible place, finding somewhere else to live, somewhere a whole lot better than this nondescript building. Anything's got to be better than this morose place. Needless to say, against all the odds, me and Hilda didn't have to do very much imagining, as the very next day Mr. Spindley was knocking at our door. I knew it was him, as the stinking smell of cigarettes gave the game away, and it made me wheeze. I opened the door and a cloud of smoke wafted straight into our apartment. Mr. Spindley had a cigarette dangling from his jaundiced, nicotine-stained fingers. I'd never seen Mr. Spindley looking so triumphant before. There was a cocky arrogance to his swagger this morning, as if he'd just won a sizable fortune on the horses. If you were to describe Mr. Spindley in feline terms, you would definitely say that he looked like the cat who'd got all the cream. And certainly if he had had a tail, it would definitely be swishing contentedly. "Hello, Mr. Spindley," I said dryly. "For what do we owe this unexpected pleasure? Our rent isn't due for another 3 weeks or so. Why are you here? Oh, don't tell me. Are you going to fix our block toilet? Now that would be a first," I said sarcastically. Mr. Spindley took a long drag from his Marlborough cigarette, and seemed to take great delight in blowing yet more billows of his white smoke directly into my face, so that my eyes began to water, and I began to sneeze. "I'm here to tell the both of you that you've got a month to pack up your things and get out," he said, fixing his steely gaze on me. And then Hilda, who was staring at him with a rather strange expression on her face that I could not figure out. It was not common for Hilda to be lost for words, but it seemed as if her tongue was tied this morning for reasons unknown. "I don't understand," I stammered. "We've been paying our rent vigilantly. We've even made some improvements around here. We're the perfect tenants, Mr. Spindley. Why would you want us out like this?" "It's nothing personal," said Mr. Spindley. "And you're right, I've had worse tenants than the both of you. But you don't half complain a lot, so maybe you'll be glad to get out of here. I never understood why you wanted to stay on here anyway, if you had so much to complain about. Most people are more grateful than the both of you are. I mean, look at Dick. He's the best tenant I've ever had. If something was broken, he fixed it himself. He's never called on me to fix any of his problems for him. It's not that hard to understand, Mr. Spindley, why we've stayed in this dump for so long, I said disparagingly. Isn't everything in life always about money? Maybe not to you, Mr. Spindley. You're probably so wealthy you don't know what it's like to count the pennies. I hate some rich people for that very reason, as they have absolutely no idea what it's like to struggle. My mother's sister is so rich she throws out perfectly good food, and I abhor the waste. I see these kind of extravagant, wasteful people at the restaurant all the time, throwing around their money indiscriminately, as if it's confetti. The rent here is affordable, Mr. Spindley. Surely you can appreciate that. We like it here for that very reason, even if this grubby apartment looks like something the bowels of hell regurgitated.
Oh, steady. That's a little harsh, isn't it?
Said Mr. Spindley, his eyes growing wide with my abrasive description of his apartment block. I dare say he'd heard it being described negatively before, but my words had thrown him off his perch.
These apartments aren't that bad, he said defensively.
I put my hands defiantly on my hips. Why are you making us leave, Mr. Spindley? I challenged him. You can't do that. We're model tenants. We rarely need to stay. We can't afford anywhere else.
It's nothing personal. I'm asking you to leave because I'm selling up, that's why. You won't have a choice in the matter, I'm afraid. If you must know, I stood my ground against that bloody-minded property developer who's been hassling me for years. Finally, the man has agreed to give me my asking price. They're going to be bulldozing this high-rise apartment, bringing up a modern state-of-the-art development in its place, I'm told, that blends in perfectly with the scenery here. Apparently there have been lots of complaints from residents in the area about this apartment block being a blight on the landscape. Can you believe that? Some people can be so goddamned rude. No respect. I'll have you know this place was in the height of fashion in the early 70s. But some people make it their life's mission to be offensive and unkind in their words, he said, looking at me scathingly. I think he included me in that projection. So I think it's a very big pity that they're bringing it down, if you ask me. This is history, you know, being turned into ashes. Historic buildings should be preserved. It's a criminal offence to take them down, if you ask me. Mr. Spindley, this is not a historic building, I'll have you know. It's not like one of those beautiful brownstone apartments. There's nothing classic about this architecture. This building development is hideous. And even in the 70s, I doubt it was remotely cool. The building is hideously ugly. And it is a blight on the landscape. I'm sorry, but it is. I'm very sorry to hear you say that about this apartment block. I'll have you know I've always thought the building rather attractive. The grey looks good against the blue sky. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news and to have to ask you to leave like this, said Mr. Spindley. But you do have 3 weeks advance notice. I'm sure you appreciate I can't turn a lucrative offer away like this. All the money is going to help me in my retirement, providing ample funds for that wife of mine to be pampered within an inch of her life. That'll keep her happy. And you know the saying, happy life, happy wife. When Mr. Spindley left, Hilda appeared to be jumping up and down like a 3-year-old toddler on a sugar high. It's working, she said excitedly. Don't you see, Iris, it's working. I've been visualizing us leaving this dump, and now we are. I groaned. Yes, we're leaving, Hilda. I hope you're happy now. You got exactly what you wanted. But where is the gold bullion that we desperately need to lead us to the new yacht that our visualization obviously purchased for us in the Mediterranean? Where is it? I said sarcastically. To say I felt annoyed with Hilda was an understatement, but I had no idea what was about to unfold over the next few days that I'd never seen coming in a month of Sundays, nor did I know my parents had been keeping a secret from me for years that was about to explode in my face. It was on a Friday morning. I was doing a waitressing shift with Hilda later in the evening. It was lunchtime,
and I needed to do some grocery shopping to stock up our beleaguered fridge that contained only a mouldy block of cheese and some withered-looking vegetables that were easily on the turn. I like to shop at the West Side Market in Manhattan, which is my absolute favourite place to buy groceries. The market is situated between 97th and 98th Street. I like the variety of stuff they have on offer there, the vast range of fabulous food choices. As I was piling up my basket with groceries, a stick of French bread, some sliced pastrami, a couple of tins of tuna, and a box of cornflakes, I happened to notice an older, well-dressed woman, with a stylish haircut, was giving me a questioningly long, hard look, almost as if in some way I looked familiar to her. I hated being stared at obtrusively by strangers. It made me feel awkwardly uncomfortable, so I hastily looked away. I was standing at the salad bar, looking at a vast range of choices at my disposal. I was wondering what olives I should select, when I felt a sharp tap on my back. I turned around, only to see the woman I'd seen moments before, apparently staring at me, now standing a foot away from me. I noticed that close up she looked oddly familiar, but I couldn't for the life of me place her. Where did I know her from? I couldn't be sure. The woman looked to be in her mid-70s, early 80s. Her hair was dyed a mixture of attractive auburn shades that was rather becoming on her pixie face. It was cut in short crop layers. She had been rather heavy-handed, with a weeping dark kohl under her hazel eyes, which were feathered by many fine lines, and her scarlet lipstick bled into the deep crevices on her lips, easily accentuating her age. I suspected she'd had some cosmetic procedures on her face, probably enjoying the benefits of Botox injectables to hold back the years, as she had an expression of permanent surprise on her face. She was wearing an elegant pair of white trousers that flared at the bottom, a clingy leopard print top, a gold belt, along with a very sensible pair of flat leather court shoes with an elegant buckle. "I'm so sorry to bother you, dear, but you're not Iris, are you? Iris Carrington." "The very same," I said, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks, as it was embarrassing not to know this woman. I wondered if she was one of our customers at the restaurant where I waitressed. I didn't know many women of her generation, so I felt rather awkward and self-conscious trying to place her. But if she did frequent our restaurant, surely I'd recognize her then. "Dear me," said the woman, waving a dismissive hand around in front of her face. "I hardly expect you to remember me, dear. The last time I saw you was when you were 8 years old. A sweet little thing you were." "You recognize me from when I was 8 years old?" I asked agog. "That's incredulous." "Well, your family resemblance is very distinctive, dear, so I never forget a face, you know." I was amazed that someone could recognize me from when I was only 8 years old. "Sorry," I said, narrowing my eyes inquisitively, as I studied the woman closely. "I still can't place you." "Oh, dear me, where on earth are my manners? I'm Judy Manning, of course." "Judy Manning?" I said out loud. Why did the name sound so familiar? I knew I'd heard it before, from a long way in the past. "Yes, I was your great-aunt Paula's very best friend." "Your great-aunt Paula, you do remember her, don't you? I know it was a long time ago for you. But, oh my word, what a wonderful woman she was. What a spirited soul. She loved the bones of you, she did, you know. She described you as the daughter she never ever had. If that woman could have had children, she would have chosen you by design. Of that I am most sure." "Oh, yes, I do remember you. You haven't changed that much." "Well, I could say the very same about you, although, of course, you are significantly older. But the resemblance you bear to your great-aunt Paula is uncanny." When I was 8, I had regularly stayed at great-aunt Paula's lavender-coloured doll's house in Mahone Bay, Nova Scotia. I remember that very well. It was a beautiful place. I used to love the extensive property, with its gloriously pretty view over the lake. and all the groves of ancient trees that fringed its borders. "Oh dear, don't tell me, love, that you sold the place," said Judy, looking at me with a sorrowful flicker in her eyes. "You didn't, did you? I suppose I can't blame you for that. Your great-aunt would have been disappointed, I hasten to say. She wanted you to have left that place not only to your children, but to your children's children. Never mind, it can't be helped. So tell me, dear, how's your mother doing these days? If I remember rightly, she was a very punctilious, particular woman. I hasten to say your great-aunt Paula found her a tad intimidating when your mother came to visit. Everything had to be absolutely perfect with your mother. Doilies on the tea tray. Your mother was insistent about using cubed sugar, and there had to be Earl Grey tea brewing in the teapot. Your mother would say that any other tea was for plebs. She was quite the snob. Oh, dear me, I'm going on and on. I'm a bit garrulous at times, and I don't mean to be rude. You've gone awfully pale. I hope I haven't offended you, my dear. Me and my big mouth. I must apologize."
"Sorry," I said. "Say that again. What do you mean, did I sell Great-aunt Paula's house in Nova Scotia? What on earth are you talking about?"
"Well, your great-aunt signed over the property to you, didn't she? But your mother was to care for it until she handed over the deeds to you when you became 21, which I assume she did. Your aunt wisely put her home in your name, under the short-term supervision of your mother, to avoid all the after-death taxes you obviously get. She wanted you to have it. Your great-aunt Paula gave your mother the deeds of the place before she died. But it's legally in your name. Remember, your great-aunt was so happy to leave the place to you, along with all the contents. She said you loved her house."
"Oh, yes," I lied. "I remember. It's just I've not been back to the place for years."
"But why don't you live there, then?" asked Judy. "I mean, Nova Scotia. What a fabulously beautiful place to live. Unless, of course, you do have to live here. But it doesn't get better than that. And you, I assume, have dual citizenship, like your mother does. I mean, you were born in Canada, were you not?"
"That's right, I was," I said.
"Well, there you go. I'm awfully relieved you didn't sell the place. It would have been an awful pity. If you don't intend to live there, maybe you should let it out to tenants. It could bring in a nice income for you, and help you keep the place well maintained."
"You make a good point there, Mrs. Manning. I'll think about it long and hard."
"Please do, my dear. And don't call me Mrs. Manning. Judy will do very nicely. I cannot believe the luck of it, bumping into you like this. What were the chances of that happening? It's a small world, let me tell you. It's really good seeing you, my dear. What a blast from the past. I don't even come here often. Once or twice a year, if the truth be told. I live on the other side, you see. But I go back to Canada every couple of years. I miss it a lot, you know. You know what they say, no place like home, and Nova Scotia, it's the very best."
Judy walked away, waving a hand at me, heading towards the bakery. I dropped my basket and all the food that I'd intended to buy. The shopping could wait. I was stunned by Mrs. Judy Manning's revelations. Could they really be true? Could Great-aunt Paula have left her house in Nova Scotia to me? My mother was sitting on the deeds to my property that I knew nothing about. I was 25 years old now. Great-aunt Paula had died when I was 10. So my mother had been sitting on the deeds for that property for over 15 years. It was sickening. Why did I know nothing about this? Why had my mother not given me the deeds to Great-aunt Paula's lavender house a long, long time ago? I could feel the anger rise up in my belly. I was soon to be homeless when Mr. Spindley finally got his way and kicked us out of the property. I had been paying my hard earnings to keep his shoddy roof over my head, here in Manhattan, and all the time I was a woman of property, a woman of means.
I could have potentially remortgaged Great Aunt Paula's house to get myself back on my feet again, or rented it out to tenants. But none of that had happened, thanks to my mother's selfishness. How dare my parents keep this from me? My mother certainly had some explaining to do. Great Aunt Paula had been dead for a long time, and her house, Purple Rain, had been laying empty, and maybe now it was in a bad state of repair, having been abandoned for so long. How could my parents do this to me? I was furious. My parents lived in Middle Village in Queens. It's one of the quintessential best middle-class places to live in New York. Most people own their own houses here. It's close to restaurants, coffee shops and bars. They live in a green leafy neighborhood close to Juniper Valley Park, which is 55 acres of glorious grassland and tall lofty trees. It's where my father would ultimately take our family bulldog Poppy for her regular morning walk. The trouble is Poppy loved her walks, but simply hated the return trip home. She wanted to stay at the park indefinitely. Being mulishly stubborn by nature, my father would have to drag that bulldog home, and people who would watch her tugging at the lead would burst out laughing. It was an amusing spectacle to behold, and everyone knew Poppy. She was considered quite the character in these parts. My parents' red-bricked house was one among many houses in this green leafy neighbourhood, where all the houses were rather unique and different, with their own individualistic characters, which made the neighbourhood rather special. The street was lined with tall lofty trees, and everybody's yard boasted manicured hedges and generous borders of pretty flowers. The one thing I did own in my rather financially slim life was a car. I prided myself in this extravagant purchase of note. The likes of such I had never ever regretted. I had bought the second-hand pink Jeep Wrangler from a young woman who had only had the thing for an entire year. She'd grown bored of it. Daddy gave her absolutely everything she wanted, so I had snapped it up at the first opportunity. It was about the only zooty, in-vogue thing that I actually owned. I parked my pink Wrangler very conspicuously outside my parents' house, preempting what I would actually say to my capricious mother, who would likely not be best pleased to see me again, after such a long, insouciant sabbatical. To put it bluntly, with no soft edges to cushion the blows, I had not actually personally seen my mother in over 2 years. My father I had seen as recently as only 2 weeks ago. We surreptitiously met up for lunch twice a month. My mother knew nothing about these clandestine cloak-and-dagger rendezvous. Moreover, my father would always ply me with some much-needed extra cash. He'd apologise profusely for my mother's bitter resentfulness towards me, proclaiming that she did indeed love me, but needed more time. How much time did a mother need before she was willing to talk to her own flesh and blood again? I mean, for goodness sake, I was her daughter, and her only one at that.
"She's still angry, Chickadoo, about your flunking college," my father told me. "You know what your mother's like. She has the memory of an elephant. She's slow to forgive. But I'm working on her, slowly and surely, trying to soften the hard edges. But you know what your mother's like, a work in progress, shall we say?"
I glanced at my parents' perfect front yard. Everything was absolutely pristine as usual. The windows so polished, the light of the day bounced off the glass. The lawn, verdant and green, was mown, and all the hedges had been given a fine haircut by a pair of very skilled fingers, while stunning displays of summer flowers liberally tumbled out of a couple of spectacular hanging baskets outside the front door. I nervously sashayed over to the glossy pink door and banged on the brass knocker. My mother adored pink, and that was about the only thing we shared in common, as it was my absolute favourite colour. "Coming!" I could hear my mother's airy voice trill through the entrance hall, as she opened the door and froze when she saw me standing there. She did not expect to see me.
"What on earth are you doing here?"
she asked me, her eyes growing cold and hard. Was she not even remotely pleased to see me, I wondered? I mean, I was her daughter, for goodness sake. "Nice to see you too," I said sarcastically. Don't you dare talk to me like that, Iris. I will remind you, you brought this all on yourself when you flunked college. Do you really expect me to be pleased to see you, after everything you've done? We invested so much in you over the years, Iris. Private schools, college, and you threw it back in our face like dirty bathwater. You were an ungrateful, spoiled little brat. Mum, don't you think you should let it all go? It's water under the bridge now, surely. Can't we move on from here? Living with bitterness is eating away at you. If you're not careful, you'll give yourself cancer. And whose fault is that, dear? It's all on you, my darling. Water under the bridge, are you joking? Said my mother, looking aghast. For you, maybe, but not for me, my girl. Mum, you're being unreasonable, and you know it. If it makes you feel any better, one day when I've raised enough money, I'll pay you back for everything. But I'm not an investment, Mum. I'm your daughter. Besides, everything in life is a gamble, isn't it? People take losses all the time on the stock market, and they move on with it, don't they? Why don't you look on the money you spent on me as an investment that failed you? Just let it go, for goodness sake. It's very easy for you to say, Iris dear. But you're not the one who spent all that hard-earned money on you. My mother eyed me through narrowing, suspicious eyes. Anyway, what do you want? What are you doing here on our doorstep like this? You have not been invited around to this property, and I certainly don't want you here. If it's money you're after, forget it, Iris. If you've blown up your life like a hand grenade, you've only got yourself to blame. We're not doling you out for anything. Don't think you can come to our doorstep begging and borrowing, because it's not going to happen. I'm here, Mum, because I'd like the deeds to the property that you've been keeping from me for over 15 long years, since Great-Aunt Paula died. You were supposed to hand over the deeds to me 5 years ago. What happened there? Why didn't you? I want them now, along with the keys and the address of Great-Aunt Paula's house in Nova Scotia. My mother's face grew pale. How do you know Aunt Paula left you her home? Your father didn't tell you, did he? No, of course he didn't. He'd never betray your trust. Would you believe it, Mum? I bumped into Judy Manning. Do you remember her? She was Great-Aunt Paula's very best friend. She asked me about Aunt Paula's property in Nova Scotia, which she told me just so happens to be mine. Imagine my surprise when I learnt that I'm actually a woman of property. Something very conveniently that you never bothered to tell me. At that moment my father came to the front door. With a big grin, he threw his arms around me in a warm hug. But judging by the expression on his face, he had heard our conversation that I'd been having with my mother. I could see relief in his eyes, as if he was finally glad that the cat was out of the bag. My mother had obviously sworn him to secrecy, and he'd hated keeping all this from me. How lovely to see you, Iris. This is a very special surprise. It's been a long time. Must have been over 2 years or so since we last saw you. How lovely. You heard our daughter, dear. She wants the deeds to her property in Nova Scotia that she owns. Don't you think you should go and get them for her? It is hers after all, is it not? He said, giving me a wink. Hold on a minute, Mum. Not so fast, I said, raising a warning hand. I want an explanation. Why the hell have you kept this from me? You could get into serious trouble for this. What you've done is against the law. You were legally expected to hand the property over to me at 21 years old, but you didn't. To say that I'm angry, Mum, is an understatement. I'm grievously upset that you've done this to me. You talk about being disappointed in me, but I'm equally as disappointed in you, so you could say we're even now. My mother practically growled at me. She waved a hand in front of her face and said, Look at you, Iris. You've made an absolute mess of your life. You flunked college, did you not? I knew if you were given the deeds to your Great-Aunt Paula's house, you'd probably sell the place, spend the money on ridiculously frivolous things that you absolutely don't need. I know how flippant and puerile this young generation is, and you're a fine example. You're harebrained and unreliable. I was going to give the deeds to you when you were older and more responsible, when you could actually be trusted. Mind you, what on earth was I thinking? I was deluding myself. Like, when was that ever going to happen? She said sarcastically, raising her brow in abject exasperation.
Mum, I hate to burst your bubble. I really do. But it's not for you to decide whether I'm worthy or not to have a property that has actually been legally left to me by Great-Aunt Paula herself. It's got nothing to do with you. This is my business, and what I decide to do with the property is my decision, I said, holding out my hands. I want the deeds and the keys to the property right now, I said in a stern, no-nonsense tone of voice. To my amazement, my mother obliged my request. She walked away with her tail between her legs, with a sulky gait, returning with the keys dangling in her hands, and a cheque for $50,000. What on earth is this money for? I asked, staring at the cheque in bewilderment. It's a hell of a lot of money. Why would you, of all people, choose to be so generous to me? Are you paying me off for my silence or something?
Nothing of the kind. It's what your great-aunt Paula left you. I feel that since you've got the keys to Purple Rain, you might as well have it all. No doubt you'll pour it down the drain. But see if I care. I'm done with you, Iris, really I am. I've worked out the interest. It's all there. You might as well have it now that you've got the house, because you're likely to blow it all in a heartbeat. I grabbed the cheque, the deeds, and the key to the house, and marched away to my car. My mother watched me from the doorway as I made my way back to the market to recover the groceries I'd left behind. I chose not to be angry with my mother. I mean, what was the point? My great-aunt Paula's house had come to me at the most perfect time, and being mad at my mother would only spoil this wonderful news that was set to change my life. "What?" said Hilda excitedly when she heard my news. "This is absolutely incredible! It's amazing! The best news ever! You have a house in Canada!" Hilda was French-Canadian, fluent in both English and French. Her parents lived in Toronto, so this good news touched her to the quick. "Oh my God, this visualization is working! We're going to Nova Scotia!" We both went out to celebrate our change in fortune, telling Mr. Spindley that he could suck eggs because we were handing our notice in way in advance and would be leaving sooner than he had anticipated. We were to learn that Dave, the overweight man in the apartment, had got so big they'd have to break down the front door for him to get him out, which was something that did not please Mr. Spindley, as he had to arrange the whole thing, and the fire department had been deployed to help evacuate him. "Good luck to the both of you," said Mr. Spindley. "I'm genuinely pleased to hear your great news." It was the nicest thing that Mr. Spindley had ever said to us. 3 days later, everything had gone smoothly. Our drive over the border crossing, where the border guards had waved us through, not being particularly interested in our passports. It was certainly strangely nostalgic and wistfully heartwarming to be back in Canada after all this time. The last time I'd actually been here was when I was 10 years old, so my sentimental, dewy-eyed memories of the place were somewhat ambiguously vague, almost as if I was looking at the past through a foggy lens, but a beguiling one at that. I was struck by how magnificently beautiful everything was. The landscape was idyllic. I could only hope that after me and Hilda had settled in Nova Scotia, that we'd find work and be received well by the local community, but only time would tell. "I'd better warn you," I said to Hilda. "I'm not quite sure what condition Purple Rain will be in. Luckily I've got some money my great-aunt left me. It's not much, but it's enough. And I'm the richest I've ever been, so I can't complain. If the worst comes to the worst, we can buy a tent from the camping shop and pitch it up on the grounds until we've fixed up the property. I hope, of course, it won't come to that. But I need to prepare you for the very worst. It's likely to be neglected and abandoned, Purple Rain, I mean. It's not going to be pretty." "Are you saying it's falling apart?" asked Hilda nervously. "I hope that's not the case," she said, crossing her fingers. "I don't fancy camping indefinitely on the grounds. I like my creature comforts. Well, I doubt the house has been touched in 15 years, so we have no idea what kind of formidable shape it'll be in. If my mother had given me the deeds when she should have, all those years ago, maybe things would be different, but it just can't be helped. I mean, think about it. The property could be hideously overgrown. The furniture could have been eaten by mice. There could be a leak in the roof, causing ruination to the innards of the house. You know what neglect does to a property. Just look at Mr. Spindley for your answers. Look at his concrete apartment block. That place was falling apart. Your mother is a piece of work, Hilda. Maybe if you find the place in a bad state of repair, you can actually sue her legally. I would if I were you. I hope she's proud of herself. What a cow! A prize one at that, keeping all this from you for so many years. I hope for our sakes the house is salvageable, and that the maintenance costs won't be too steep. Because if the house is a pile of junk, it might not be worth much. Mind you, the land it's on could be worth a bob or two. My GPS was telling me where to go. Finally we took a bend on a sequestered road, where the lakefront properties sat on sprawling plots of land, and that was when I saw the neat crisp sign, Purple Rain. I knew I'd found Great Aunt Paula's place. I could feel my whole body twitching with nervous trepidation and anxiety as my pink Jeep Wrangler took the twisted knot in the road, fringed by tall, lofty, imposing trees, and then my Jeep rolled down an earthen driveway strewn with scattered leaves. Then there she was, proud and tall, Great Aunt Paula's violet-coloured house, nestled on a hilly outcrop, overlooking the pebbly beach and the silvery lake that was reflecting a pearly ethereal light in the late afternoon. "My God!" said Hilda, drawing in an astounded breath. "The house is perfect! It's beautiful! It's spectacular! It's awesome! I can't believe it! There's no way in 100 million years that this house is remotely derelict or abandoned. It looks so perfect. It looks as if it's been maintained, as does the yard. Everything is glowing. The paint is fresh. The windows are as good as new. I don't understand any of this. How is it remotely possible? The house should have succumbed to some wear and tear, surely." Suddenly a horrifying thought trespassed across my mind, and that was when I wondered if the house, having been abandoned for so long, might have become occupied by unpaying tenants, who thankfully had been looking after the place, but had lightly exploited an empty house for their own ends. I expressed these extreme misgivings to Hilda. "It's your property. You call the police," she assured me. "If someone's living there illegally, they can be turfed out." "It's not as easy as that," I assured her. We both cautiously climbed out of the car and sashayed towards the front door. I was about to put a key in the lock, but the door just swung open on its own accord. Hilda and I exchanged befuddled, rather ominous glances, and I called out into the house, "Hello! Hello! Is anyone there?" But there was no answer. Hilda and I gingerly entered the property, and everything gleamed brightly. Great Aunt Paula's antique furnishings were exactly as I remembered, but everything, even on the inside, was freshly painted and new. "What the hell?" said Hilda. "This place hasn't deteriorated in the slightest. Someone has been looking after this premises." "But who?" I asked in wonderment. "Who?" Hilda shrugged her shoulders nonchalantly. We made our way to the downstairs kitchen, which looked as if it had been recently modernized. But how was that possible? Hilda sashayed towards the fridge and commented that it was on, and when she opened the door, she acted as if she'd been stung by a bee. "Oh, my God!" she piped. "Someone is living here! The fridge is loaded with food!" Just as we were digesting this horrifying revelation, and I was wondering how I was going to toss out an unpaying lodger, who had no right to be here, but if it wasn't for them, him or her, that is, and their maintenance of this place, I could have returned to a very bleak picture indeed. So in some way I did owe them big time for the work they'd done to Purple Rain. All of a sudden I nearly jumped out of my skin as a well-rounded, rather buxom woman entered the kitchen. She must have been in her early 70s, with a full head of curly grey hair, and was clearly as fit as a fiddle, with a smooth skin that didn't seem to own a single wrinkle. She was wearing an apron around her ample middle and had a duster in her hands. She smiled at me warmly through a pair of bright bear-like eyes, which accentuated the dimples in her cheeks. She was the kind of cheery woman you couldn't help but like at once.
"Oh, my word, I don't believe it. It must be Iris Carrington. I'd have recognised you in a whole hall of strangers. You're so distinctive, just like your great-aunt Paula. Oh, my word, it is so good to see you. It's been a long time. My, you have grown up into a fine-looking woman. Oh, I'm not sure if you remember me, dear. I used to clean this house for your great-aunt Paula, you know, when she was alive. But I'm sure you must have forgotten me. It was a lifetime ago, I suspect, for you."
I gasped. "You must be Meg Russo." The woman ran towards me, throwing her arms around me, wrapping me in a warm hug, and I was surprised to see tears gathering in her eyes.
"You must forgive me, my dear,"
she said, sniffing, pulling out a hanky from her apron pocket and waving a hand before her eyes apologetically.
"Forgive me, getting so emotional and sentimental like this. But as I was saying, you're the splitting image of your Aunt Paula when she was your age. So it's bringing back so many memories to me. I knew your great-aunt Paula for many, many years, when we were children, you know."
"But what are you doing here, Meg?" I asked.
"What am I doing here?" she clucked. "What does it look like? I keep the place clean, of course, well maintained. Have been doing so since your great-aunt Paula died. Your father immediately got in touch with me and told me to take care of this place for him. So I've been working here every week, keeping it in apple pie order. He phoned me the other day, told me to get a whole lot of food into the house. He said that you were moving in with a friend. I was so thrilled to hear the great news. About time, too. Purple Rain has been standing empty for 15 long years. Such a waste, if you ask me. But now you're here, there will be life in Purple Rain again, and young life, too, which is exactly what it needs. And that would make your great-aunt Paula very happy indeed."
"So my dad's behind how good this place looks?" I asked, bewildered.
"Oh, didn't you know?" said Meg. "Your dad's a very good man. If it weren't for him, this place could have become derelict. And who is it we have here?" she asked me, her bright eyes fixing on Hilda.
"This is Hilda. She's my very best friend. She's moving into the house with me. She's from Canada as well. She's got dual citizenship like I have." Meg looked chuffed to see me.
"The two of you looked so dreadfully tired, if you don't mind my saying so. So I'll love you and leave you. We can catch up another time."
I couldn't believe that my father had preserved Great-aunt Paula's house for me, so I knew I had much to thank him for. It was so typical of him to be this generous. I realized that even though my father never stood up to my mother, he had always been looking out for me from when I was little, and for that I was incredibly grateful. I was so lucky to have a father like him. I knew he had maintained my investment without my mother's knowledge, and for that I knew I would always be indebted to him. I could let go my chagrin towards my mother, because now I had nothing to be begrudging about. The following morning I got up really early and decided to take a casual stroll to the lake, which was not far away from the house. When I slipped past Hilda's room, I could hear her light snores and realized she was sound asleep. I quickly slipped into the kitchen. It was about 5 a.m. It was most unlike me to be up and about this early in the morning, but I couldn't sleep. It was impossible for me to flush away the excitement that I was the owner of a property that was in perfect condition, and to boot, I had $50,000 in the bank, after having been penniless for so very long. It was hard not to wipe the contented smile off my face. Life was beginning to look up. I put on a pair of jogging pants, some walking boots, and a sweatshirt and scrambled towards the lake, leaving the house from the steps of the wraparound porch that overlooked the exquisite body of water, a view that I knew I would never ever tire of, and I had remembered so vibrantly from my youth. I could almost see Great Aunt Hilda sitting there on the wraparound porch, on her rocking chair, knitting one of her spectacular thick woolen sweaters, while together we enjoyed the views over the lake. They were so prepossessing. We would remain on the porch talking for ages, just looking out at those fabulous views. The sky was now a very light grey colour. The remnant of the night, like a smoke from a chimney, began to gradually dissipate. I could see a round disk of orange light rising over the rippling stretch of water, sending shimmering shadows dancing across the silvery lake. I was absolutely mesmerised by how perfectly magnificent it all was. There was a selection of old weeping willow trees hanging over the edge of the beach, stretching out to meet a sizable congregation of trees, lush with leafy green foliage. The ribbon of beach stretched out before me like a sizable yawn. I walked over to a rocky outcrop on the edge of the water that had been man-made at some point in time by my great-aunt's husband. I sat down to watch the sun rise over the horizon and decided to entertain myself by gathering some loose stones to skim across the lake. My great-aunt Paula had taught me the technique of throwing stones, but I had long since forgotten that skill, so my futile, ungainly attempts were clumsy to say the very least. All of a sudden I heard a distinctive chuckling sound. I was absolutely certain that someone was laughing at me at my expense and my ineffectual efforts at throwing out a stone into the water, so I felt somewhat piqued. I turned around to examine my surroundings more closely, skimming the trees with my eyes to see if I could detect any sign of movement, but nothing was there. In a trice, stones were taking flight randomly through the trees, like darts being aimed at a dartboard, and these stones were projected into the water so perfectly, putting my lousy efforts to shame. I guess I thought some kid who had trespassed on our property was taking great delight in showing me up. So as not to be outdone, I gathered some more stones, hoisting them this time, throwing them very carefully into the water so that in some way I could redeem myself. I would show that gloating kid, whoever they were, hiding behind the trees, I suspected, that I wasn't such a bad shot after all. I eagerly grabbed a handful of more stones, tossing them one by one into the water, very noisily. Something in the trees was hooting again with laughter at me, so much so that I could feel myself flushing pink with embarrassment. I'd never heard such a strange laughter before. I was about to march indignantly through the trees to tell that kid, whoever they were, that they weren't welcome on my property and to go away, that Purple Rain was now occupied and they needed to leave. If they were going to laugh at me so rudely, show off how much better and more superior they were than me, then I didn't want them around at all. Before I could do anything, a timorous shape of about 3 foot tall came running through the trees towards me, with a reluctant, rather evasive hesitancy. I realized in a second that I was observing a juvenile Bigfoot. I could hardly believe it. She was female, and rather on the skinny side, with thin wispy legs, overlong arms, and a body completely covered in long flowing dark hair, apart from her face that was incredibly human-looking. The little Bigfoot stared at me merrily, through the prettiest brown eyes I've ever seen, that were filled with a spirited mischief. Honestly, I felt absolutely no fear. She pointed to my clenched hand, which I reluctantly opened up. She removed the stone from my palm, and began demonstrating to me the skillful technique of how to throw a stone. I remember being caught up in her lesson. I was mesmerized by her, so much so that I barely noticed the sun rise over the horizon, as the little Bigfoot chattered and clapped excitedly every time I improved upon my technique. I marvelled how she could throw a stone over such a long distance with such precision and so much grace. The two of us were chuckling away together, as if we'd been friends for many years. I almost forgot that she was a Bigfoot, as hanging around with her seemed like the most natural thing to be doing in all the world. All of a sudden, disturbing the pleasing silence, was a shrill whistle. I looked up to see a large, formidable female Bigfoot standing among the trees, looking less than enamoured with her child for brazenly interacting with me, even though she'd obviously done so with a hesitant, prevaricating evasiveness, like a kid who knows they're doing something naughty, but they can't help themselves anyway. Once the little Bigfoot had shown me how to throw stones the correct way. It would seem a bubbling enthusiasm had taken her over, and her shyness had promptly receded. But now she knew she was in trouble. Her affronted mother remained standing there rather stiffly between the trees, barely moving at all, with a less than amused expression on her human-looking face. The Bigfoot became rather bashful, looking nervously from me to its mother. It immediately ran over to its mother, to redeem herself from her mother's impending wrath. I could see the mother Bigfoot seemed to be scolding her daughter telepathically in some kind of exchange. I could almost hear her saying, "What on earth do you think you're doing? Playing with a human being like this? You're not supposed to do this." The little Bigfoot hung her head in shame, grabbing the hair on her mother's legs to appease her, like a shy child might do in a public place. There are no words to describe how big the mother Bigfoot was. She was powerful and intimidating, possibly the scariest creature I've ever beheld in my entire life. In normal circumstances, seeing her might have made me scream out, run for the hills. But I was so bewildered, I stood there gawking at her, my jaw dropping wide open like a Venus flytrap. I think it was hard for me to grasp her Herculean size. I became aware of how fragile and vulnerable I was. I knew how protective mothers could be in the wild over their cubs. A mother bear could easily kill you in a heartbeat if you ventured close to her offspring. Would this mother Bigfoot do the same to me, I wondered? My body shook in a nervous trepidation. Sweat began to break out on my upper lip. I felt as if I wanted the ground to swallow me whole, so I could get away from this imposing creature. But surely she could see I imposed absolutely no threat to her daughter, that we'd just been having fun together, the two of us. I meant the little thing absolutely no harm. Indeed, the creature had helped me improve my technique in throwing stones into the water. Then the most extraordinary thing happened. The female Bigfoot was staring at me, curiously. Then a light of recognition came into her face, like I'd seen in Judy Manning at the store, and in the housekeeper of Purple Rain. Now I was seeing it in the female Bigfoot, who clearly recognized me at once, and then her demeanour changed and softened. Oh my goodness, she rarely recognized me, even though I had no recollection of her at all. She began chatting away at me excitedly, as if seeing an old friend that she hadn't seen for a very long time. She patted my back enthusiastically, so much so that the little Bigfoot's former sense of shame had been replaced with a spark of hope. Maybe she would not get into trouble with her mother after all. Her mother's reaction towards me had significantly changed. I certainly got the sense that Bigfoots are obviously actively discouraged from interacting with human beings, but I realized I was obviously the exception to this rule, as this mother Bigfoot genuinely seemed thrilled to see me. When she realized I didn't remember her at all, or understand a word of what she was saying to me, as she was talking so fast in a language that I couldn't understand, she began to fill my head with memories that came flooding back, and I wondered how I'd forgotten them at all. Had I blocked the trauma of what had happened away like you do when things are so bad that remembering them is too expensive a cost on your personal peace, and so the brain, to protect you, retracts those memories, buries them away in the recesses of your mind, locks them up so that the nightmarish event will not cruelly rob you of your sense of safety in the world? It seemed like that. I did do some research on the matter, I have to say, and learnt it was indeed true. It would seem victims of trauma will naturally conveniently not remember all the details of that horror they faced, like a woman not recalling a sharp knife being held against her throat when a perpetrator intended to slash her, or someone who doesn't remember the full details of being chased by a rampaging bull elephant when they were certain they were about to be trampled to death. Could it be these people erased the memory? It was too painful for them to reflect over, too traumatic. Are our brains naturally hardwired to help us bounce back from a dreadful situation with a healing resilience. It would certainly seem so. Is that what had happened to me? Because I knew many people that had very little to no memory of their childhoods, but this memory came crashing right back like an ocean wave thundering against the rocks. I began to remember one of the most horrifying days of my little life, when staying here at Purple Rain with Great Aunt Hilda, that something quite traumatic had happened to me. It was like remembering something being played back to me in a movie. I was 8 years old at the time, staying an entire blissful week with my Great Aunt Paula at Purple Rain. My parents were going to Bangladesh and India for a week's holiday. My mother fancied an exotic location where she could enjoy the benefits of eating spicy food. They were, of course, incredibly grateful that my Great Aunt Paula would take charge over me while they were away. "It's no problem at all," she told my parents. "Iris here is like a daughter to me. I love the bones of her. It's going to be absolutely wonderful having her staying here with me for an entire week. The two of us are going to have so much fun together, aren't we, Iris?" I had nodded. "It's going to be the best because I'm staying here at Purple Rain with Great Aunt Paula." I knew life with Great Aunt Paula would be so much nicer than being with my parents. Even at 8 years old, my mother would put the pressure on me to perform at school, so it was like a stranglehold in my life. I knew staying at Great Aunt Paula's would be a welcome break from her. The week had gone by far too fast. There was only a couple of days left before my parents returned from Bangladesh to pick me up. How I wished I could stretch out time like an elastic band and stay with Great Aunt Paula for ever and ever here in Nova Scotia. "I don't want to go home," I told Great Aunt Paula. "I want to live with you forever and ever, Aunt Paula, because you're so nice and we have so much fun together." "But you know you can't do that, Iris, love. Your place is with your parents. But you're welcome to stay here at Purple Rain whenever you like." "But I don't want to go home. I hate my mummy," I protested. "You hate your mum?" asked Great Aunt Paula, looking bewildered. "But why do you hate her, Iris dear? She doesn't hurt you, does she, physically, I mean?" "No, but she's very, very bossy. She always tells me what to do, and she makes me work so hard at school." Great Aunt Paula sighed with relief when she realized I was obviously not being physically abused by my mother, but simply resented all the homework that she made me do. She reached out to squeeze my hand encouragingly. "I know, Iris dear, that your mother is a very difficult woman. She's rather headstrong, isn't she? Not always easy to understand. But I believe, despite everything, she wants the best for you, just like any other parent does, which might not be easy for you to understand at your age." "I don't like her. She's bossy, and she's always telling me what to do." "I know, sweetheart. I know it's difficult, but she does love you." I was sitting on the wraparound porch with my Great Aunt Paula, and we talked about my mother for a while, and then she began to read me Alice in Wonderland, and I wondered what it would be like to own a pair of red sparkly shoes. The day was slowly collapsing in on itself like a folding camping chair, as the sun began to cast its golden glaze over the sky, in a collection of golds, tangerines, and pinks. It was so prepossessingly beautiful that even at 8 years old, I appreciated the exquisite colours that trespassed across the fading blue sky. "Doesn't the sunset look beautiful this evening?" said my aunt. "We get some of the best sunsets out here in Nova Scotia, you know. Maybe I can buy some acrylic paints in town tomorrow for the both of us. We can sit here on the wraparound porch and paint the sunset. I can put your picture on the fridge with a magnet if you like, and I'll be able to look at it when you're not here. Maybe you can also paint a picture of Alderella. who was Great-Aunt Paula's big black devoted cat, who was always bringing in mice into the house.
Cool! I'd like to do that. It would be so nice to paint the sunset,
I said enthusiastically.
I love painting. I'll also paint you, Great-Aunt Paula, and I'll paint Dorella as well. Then I'll paint the sunset 'cause it's always pretty. And you can keep all my pictures on your fridge.
That's settled then, my dear. We'll go to town tomorrow and get those paints,
said Great-Aunt Paula, who continued to read to me from Alice in Wonderland. And then the book just dropped out of her hand, and she suddenly fell into a deep sleep. I suspect she was absolutely exhausted looking after a rather demanding 8-year-old child. And furthermore, Great-Aunt Paula had no children of her own, so she didn't have the buoyant resilience that other parents would likely have, who develop a fitness for dealing with their taxing children, as you do in life with anything that you spend long enough doing. I began to chuckle as my Great-Aunt Paula snored, her head flopping over to one side at an odd angle, and the loose book in her hands looked like it might drop to the floor with a mighty crash. So I removed it from her hand and replaced it on the Adirondack coffee table. It would be nice if she would finish the story, but my aunt was tired, and it would be rude to wake her up. My mother had always taught me that when people were napping, you left them to it. I remember glancing out towards the silvery lake, and something got my immediate attention. A little boy of round about my age was standing at the edge of the water on the sandy beach, under the setting sun, waving at me excitedly. I remember wondering who on earth he was, and where he'd come from, but those details did not matter. They eluded me. I could see that the little boy was eager to play with me. He was waving his hands as if to encourage me to join him on the beach. My Aunt Hilda had always told me to never go near the lake unsupervised.
"There are things in the lake, my dear," she explained. "Things that are not very good. You mustn't play without me watching over you. The water can be very dangerous. You could drown. Do you know what drowning is, Iris?" she asked me. "It's important to know about these things, my dear, so that you don't do anything silly, because I live by the water, and your mother would never forgive me if something bad were to happen to you."
Drowning means you go under the water and you die 'cause you can't breathe. I know 'cause my mummy says that rose beetles that float on the top of the water of our kiddies' outside pool that she puts up in the summer die 'cause they drown. She says they can't fly away from the water once they're stuck on top of it.
"Well done, Iris. I'm very proud of you. Clever girl. Your parents don't want you going anywhere near the water while you're here, for that very reason. You don't want to end up becoming like a rose beetle, do you? Do you understand what I'm saying?"
I had nodded.
"Cross my heart, hope to die that I'm not going to play anywhere near the lake without you watching over me, Great-Aunt Paula."
"Good girl. That's what I want to hear."
I had nodded at her, but now as I saw the boy waving at me excitedly from the beach by the lake, the promises I had made to my Aunt Paula faded, and I ebulliently ran down the wooden steps of the wraparound porch towards the beach, eager to join the boy. As a kid, I was accepting of this idiosyncratic, rather bizarre chain of events. I wasn't in a quandary about them whatsoever. It seemed the most natural thing in the world to see a boy waving at me from the beach, even though he should never have been there in the first place on Great-Aunt Paula's property. But that thought did not even cross my mind. I ran eagerly towards the little boy, calling out to him,
Wait for me, I'm coming to play with you. Don't go away."
I was wearing a pretty white summer floral print dress that floated around my skinny legs, and a pair of long white socks that came up to under my knees, along with a pair of little white leather shoes with a strap and a buckle. I was eager to play with this little boy. I was growing restlessly bored now that Aunt Paula had fallen fast asleep. When I reached the handsome, blonde-haired, blue-eyed boy, I zealously threw off my socks and shoes, throwing them rather haphazardly across the beachy sand. I was a little out of breath by this time. The boy was wildly chuckling at me, as if this was a great big game we were playing together. I responded in kind by bursting into a fit of girlish giggles. The boy held out his arm towards me, clutching my hand tightly in his grasp, and my clammy little hand was suffocated by the pressure he exerted on me.
"You're hurting me! Let go!"
I cried out. He loosened his grip on me. I reluctantly, with a vacillating hesitancy, began to walk into the lake. I wasn't sure I liked this game. Getting wet was not exactly my idea of fun, and the dress I was wearing was brand new, as Great-Aunt Paula had bought it for me at a boutique earlier on in the morning, and I certainly did not want to ruin it. After he'd freed my hand, the insistent boy that didn't appear to be taking no for an answer brazenly beckoned for me to follow him in to the water. His shorts were now soaked by the lake, but he didn't appear to mind getting wet. Maybe he could swim, I thought enviously. I was not supposed to go into the water. I'd promised Great-Aunt Paula that I wouldn't, and besides that, I didn't know how to swim. I knew I was blowing caution to the wind, going into the lake like this. I didn't want the boy to see that I was scared, because he might think I was a sissy, and I wanted him to be my friend. I hadn't met any other kids like him around the area, and I didn't want to lose his friendship by being a spoilsport. Great-Aunt Paula had been very strict about my not going into the water, but I wouldn't go very far, I assured myself. The little boy was very persistent and persuasive. He held out his hand towards me. I reluctantly took it again, warning him not to hold my hand too tightly.
"Last time you hurt me. You've got to hold my hand lightly."
The boy gave me a horrible, gormless grin. There was something wrong with his eyes. His face seemed to be going a little static, like a television when it goes on the blink. And as he looked at me, his eyes grew darker and darker and cold, and the warm friendliness of his earlier demeanour seemed to fade. I winced out in pain as his hand began to dig into mine. I tried to snatch it away. I wanted to run away from this boy, as far away as I could. There was something terribly wrong with him, something insidious about him. I didn't like him any more. I didn't care to be his friend, but it was too late. The boy forcefully, with a powerful thrust, dragged me under the water with a superhuman strength and pulled me up again. I was gasping for breath. I could barely breathe. When I resurfaced from the water in the lake, I was spluttering and coughing, my body bursting for oxygen that was denied to me. There was no little boy holding me now, but this ugly, grotesque-looking creature that looked like an otter and stood up on two legs like a man. He was covered in shiny, sleek, dark brown hair that was thick and knitted together tightly. His dark brown eyes were cunningly malicious, and I was certain he was going to eat me. There were no kindness in those deviously sly, manipulative eyes of his that seemed to become hungry, as drool and spittle seemed to spill out the corner of his lips, as if he was actually salivating over me. My little heart thundered in my tiny chest, and tentacles of my soaking hair cascaded over my cheeks. My wet clothes clung to me like a wetsuit. I was shivering from the cold that pierced through bone and sinew, and was causing my flesh to break out in goosebumps. The furtive, malevolent creature and his grip was so tight on me that he grabbed me to his chest. He was about to swim away with me, almost as if I was a prized trophy he'd take great pleasure in devouring. That was when I distinctly heard a pair of powerful feet crashing through the water, generously rippling the surface of the lake. The next thing I knew, a fight ensued, with much growling, splashing, and indignant grunting. The strong-willed, big otter-like humanoid was holding on to me tightly, but he was whacked across the face with a powerful fist, and for a moment became disorientated and confused, enough for him to release his hold over me. I slipped away from his grasp like butter and began to sink into the depths of the dark water, but something grabbed my soaking body, throwing me onto his powerful back and running with me through the lake, across the beach sand, towards my grandmother's porch. When we finally reached the porch, this powerful thing put me down, only yards away from where my grandmother was obliviously fast asleep. I could not believe she had not woken from the huge commotion. She seemed locked under the hypnotism of a very deep sleep. I was coughing and spluttering on the porch, and this thing was patting my back to help me get the water out of my lungs. When I looked up, I was staring into the face of the female Bigfoot that I was looking at now, who had recognized me after all these long years. I do remember how tall and powerful she was, especially for an 8-year-old girl, but I knew at once she had saved my life. She had the kindest eyes I had ever beheld, and she spoke to me in my head, in some form of telepathic exchange. "Go safely, little girl. Wake up that adult that's taking care of you," she said, pointing to my great-aunt Paula. "It's not safe to play in the water without an adult around. That thing you saw was pretending to be a boy, and a boy he certainly was not. He's a shapeshifter. His name is Tawenga. He's no good. Been up to his Machiavellian tricks for years, he has. His kind are treacherously dangerous. You must stay well away from him. He'll pretend to be anything he wants to get you to do his bidding. If I hadn't seen you, he might have eaten you up. Be very careful, little girl. Next time I might not be here to save you." I was about to say something, but the Bigfoot patted me on the back and glided through the trees like a lightning flash, and then she was gone. I rushed over to my sleeping aunt, shaking her vigorously to wake her up, spraying her with all the water from the lake. I was blubbering like a baby. My wet dress clung to me tightly, making me suddenly consciously cold. My hair, wet as it was, dangled around my face in rat's tails. My great-aunt did not appreciate being sprayed by icy cold water, and in her bleary, languid state began pushing me away, as if I was a wet dog prancing all over her. My aunt seemed disorientated. She opened her eyes suddenly, and when she saw me, the colour drained from her face. "Oh, my goodness gracious," she said, throwing her hand over her mouth. "You're soaking wet, my girl. Don't tell me you've been at the lake. You saw him, didn't you? You saw the Kushtaka. You saw Otterman. Oh, goodness gracious me."
"The boy wanted to play with me, but then he changed into a great big Otterman. He looked like a human with a long tail. He grabbed me, Great-aunt Paula. I was so scared, so frightened. I thought he was going to eat me." My great-aunt Paula grabbed me by the shoulders, and with frightened eyes looked directly into mine. "You listen to me, Iris. First of all, we need to get you out of these wet clothes, or you'll catch your death of cold, so you better come with me. But I want you to know that that was not a little boy you saw. Why would there be a boy on this property? This is my home. I have not invited any little boys over here. So if you see something like that, then it's likely not real. Do you understand that?" "But I saw him, Great-aunt Paula. He was a little boy, and then he changed into something else. I thought he was going to eat me. He was the scariest thing I've ever seen." "What you saw was an Otterman, often known as a Kushtaka. They live around lakes here in North America, Canada, and Alaska. There's stories about him everywhere. He's been seen in these parts. Many missing people are suspected to be connected to him. Unfortunately, the creature is artfully clever. He shapeshifts to deceive his victims, so that they become easy prey for him." "What does shapeshift mean, Great-aunt Paula?" "It means, Iris, that the Kushtaka can change into a little boy, so you'll go and play with him. Then he drags you into the depths of the lake and swims away with you. He can pretend to be anything he likes. I've seen him before myself once at the lake. Soon after my husband passed away, he shapeshifted in front of me into my husband. Can you believe that? It broke my heart, it did." "You've seen him yourself?"
I asked incredulously. "I'm afraid I have, my dear. I was taking a walk at the lake. It was shortly after your great-uncle died. and that was when the Kushtaka appeared to me. He liked to toy with me, you see. Before my very eyes he changed into my late husband. But I knew it was a trick, and he seemed to be enjoying the sadness it brought upon me. It was a terrible experience. He's got a Machiavellian sense of humour, you see, Iris dear. I don't know why I never told my aunt about the Bigfoot that had brought me back home safely. I guess my great-aunt assumed I had managed to escape the Kushtaka's grasp on my own, which would not have been remotely possible. My life had been spared by a female Bigfoot who had lashed out at the Ottoman and saved my life. I was incredibly lucky. I do know my great-aunt Paula did not believe she had accidentally fallen asleep that day. She believed the Kushtaka had sent her off into a dreamy state, so that I could be surreptitiously lured away to an almost certain death. She described her sleep as being unusually deep. I remember my great-aunt Paula was worried that I would tell my parents what had happened to me, but that would never have happened. My mother had zero tolerance to all things that seemed remotely fanciful. She'd have never believed our account. Please don't tell your mother, Iris dear, what happened here this evening, my aunt asked me. I would hate it if she refused to allow you to stay here at Purple Rain again. You know what she's like.
Don't worry, I won't tell her about it.
The mere idea of confiding in my mother was just impossible to even contemplate. I had kept my mouth tightly shut, but it would seem the trauma of being attacked by this bizarre-looking creature had meant my brain had wiped the memory clean away. The Bigfoot clearly wanted me to remember the whole experience, to view it from an angle in which I wasn't emotionally connected to the experience. She looked at me solemnly and then spoke to me in an automatic download of words that were spoken into my head in more of an understanding. Be careful, she confided in me. You might be older and wiser now, but it certainly doesn't mean you can't be fooled by this thing. He's duplicitous. He's been around these parts for a long time, and unfortunately he resides around here, where there's more scattered human habitation. You must have your wits about you at all times. He's always on the prowl, looking for an unsuspecting victim to seduce. Your age is of little consequence. He will snatch humans away if he can get them to be vulnerable. He easily fools his prey. He roams around this stretch of lake frequently, so be very wary. What, even now? I asked the Bigfoot. The Bigfoot nodded. This was sobering news for me. I knew from my reactivated memory that this creature was masterfully cunning, and I certainly didn't want another interaction with him ever again. Next time I might not be so lucky. It's good to see you again, said the Bigfoot. I remembered your energy and your eyes. This is my daughter Akina. My name is Kaneka. I'm so glad you've come back. The house has been lonely without any occupants. The Bigfoot gave me a nod, took the little Bigfoot's hand in hers. They both nodded at me with their bright treacle-coloured eyes that displayed a genuine kindness and warmth. And I watched them both glide back gracefully into the heart of the woods. I eagerly ran back to the house to tell Hilda about the extraordinary thing that had happened to me. I wondered if she would believe me. I doubted that she would. Hilda was heartily annoyed to be shaken awake by me. I'm tired, she complained. Iris, I'm exhausted. Why won't you let me sleep? Because I've got something insane to tell you, that's why. You're never going to believe it. Can't it wait? Asked Hilda begrudgingly. I'm really tired, Iris. How about I get a bucket of ice-cold water to wake you up, then? Hilda sat up with a resigned acceptance, following me into the kitchen, where she sat down on one of the bar stools of the kitchen island, and I prepared a hot mug of coffee for her. She listened to me with wide eyes as I told her my incredible story. She couldn't believe it. This is insane, she said. Do you know how crazy that sounds? But I believe every word. You can't make this stuff up. Sorry to say this to you, Iris. Much as I love you, you're no Tolkien. 6 months later, Hilda's account. As you can imagine, the story that my best friend Iris recounted to me about her paradoxical encounter and how she'd been saved when she came a hair's breadth away from being snatched away by this beast when she was only 8 years old, because it was artfully cunning and had pretended to be a little boy that was eager to play with her. The female Bigfoot she had encountered had made her remember the old trauma that she had buried away like a pirate might bury away an old treasure map, but the trauma from the event seemed to have been wiped away, as if she was looking at it like you might watch a movie. I was enjoying living at Purple Rain in Nova Scotia. Me and Iris had big plans to start up our own business together, but had not decided exactly what it is we would do yet. For the time being, we both had jobs waitressing tables in town to bring in extra cash. It was certainly an excellent way to get to know the locals better. I worried a little, I have to admit, about the lake, wondering whether I really was in danger with an encounter with the Kushtaka. I asked the locals if they had any experience with Ottoman. Some people had never heard of the creature before, but others most certainly had. Most of these people tended to live in built-up parts of Nova Scotia, so encounters for them would likely be rather rare, or at the very least exceedingly unlikely. Purple Rain was situated on a sizable property, overlooking the lake, so if a creature like that existed, it would certainly choose to live in a more wild location like this, where it would be unlikely to be seen, and be free to wander at will. Of course, people had stories about Ottoman and Bigfoots, but it was someone else they knew in passing that had had a strange experience, and that was too remote for me to be a reliable source of witness.
No, I haven't seen the Ottoman myself, I was frequently told, but yes, I've heard stories about him. They say he's connected to missing people, and that he can shapeshift.
My bizarre, outlandish account occurred on a Saturday morning. Meg was still cleaning for us at Purple Rain, on the insistence of Iris's father, who wanted to continue giving the woman an income. Iris had been so grateful that her father had been responsible for the upkeep of Purple Rain, and didn't want his daughter's inheritance from her aunt to go into a pile of smoke. He was a kind, generous and thoughtful man, and knew Meg needed this job, and so he insisted on paying her for her services, and she cleaned Purple Rain 4 days a week, and me and Iris were not complaining about that. Who doesn't appreciate having the cleaning done for you? I remember it was a Friday morning, and Meg arrived with her grandson.
I hope you don't mind me bringing him here with me. My daughter-in-law's father has been taken into hospital with gallstones, would you believe? He was in agonizing pain last night. Thought he was dying. He was rushed to hospital. He's doing fine now, I'm glad to say. But my daughter-in-law needs to be at his side to comfort him. So she's asked me to look after this little thing. I promise you he won't be a problem. I'll keep a firm eye on him. I brought some Lego blocks for him to play with, to keep him very busy.
He's welcome here, said Iris, bending down to ruffle the cute little boy's hair that lazily frolicked around his round face in a sea of billowing curls.
What's your name, kiddo?
She asked the boy.
Angus, said the boy proudly. I'm 5 years old. Mummy says I'm getting big because next year I'll be 6.
Yes, you're a big boy, said Iris. I'm sure you're clever as well. Clever boys don't go near the lake, do they?
No, they don't,
agreed Angus. It was a rather overcast day, looking potentially as if the promise of rain might be very much on the cards. It was not the kind of weather that would tempt me to go wandering around the lake, or the woods for that matter. I would reserve those outside expeditions for more congenial weather. I had decided I would stay indoors today. It was a wise thing for me to do. I could smell the petrichor in the air. I'd been in my bedroom looking at YouTube videos until my phone went completely blank while listening to a very interesting program about the functioning of the brain, which I found enormously informing. I realized the energy had expired on my cell phone and needed charging, which was rather annoying, but what could I do? I slipped my phone into the charger on my bedside table and waited for the green light to come, informing me my phone was now being charged. Never mind, I'd do the next best thing, and that was to read my book. I had found that Iris's great-aunt Paula demolished books like some people devour candy, She had obviously been an avid reader during the course of her life, looking to books for her source of entertainment. I did wonder how people back in the day, without the influences of Google, Facebook and YouTube, kept themselves busy. I decided they must have read a lot. Iris's aunt had an entire library of books that filled the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves with all kinds of books, from the encyclopedia to some leather-bound books that looked rather ancient. There were all kinds of thrillers from more recent years, a vast selection of cooking books going back to old Mrs. Beeton. There were even piles of Enid Blyton's and Nancy Drew books that were in that library. I had not read anything for years, but I had selected a promising thriller that I was beginning to thoroughly enjoy. I remembered I'd left the book lying open on the Adirondack coffee table on the wraparound porch, so I decided I would go out and get it. I fancied reading until lunch, after which I would be going into town to pick up some groceries with Iris. We would be spending the afternoon cooking, as we had invited a couple of locals for dinner. I skirted past Meg, who was in the living room, where the sliding doors of the open-plan living space opened out onto the wraparound porch. I could see Meg with a hoover, using the end of the nozzle to remove the dust from the rather sumptuous-looking sofa. She was punching the cushions vigorously when I entered the living room. I nodded at her, gesturing I was going out onto the porch for a second. I think she misunderstood me, because she promptly switched off the hoover. I knew Meg liked to talk the hooves off a donkey, if given half a chance. While I liked the jolly woman very much, I didn't fancy a long chat.
"You're not going out there, are you?" she asked me, looking appalled. "Look at the weather. It's so overcast. It's going to bucket down with rain shortly. You don't want to be caught up in that. There's quite a wind current, you know. You can actually hear the wind howling." "Well, you needn't worry, Meg. I'm not going for a walk. I left my book out there on the wraparound porch. I'm just going to get it." "Well, that's a relief," said Meg. "I was thinking these city folk from New York don't know how to pay attention to the signs. The grey sky tells me all I need to know, and that a storm is brewing. Let me tell you that." "Wow, you're a reader, are you?" she asked me, looking rather approvingly. "That's so lovely to hear. I was beginning to think that your generation are a little backward in that regard when it comes to the English language, but I'm glad I'm wrong. Obviously, young people still read." "Of course we do," I said defensively. "Oh, I'm sorry, dear. I really did put my foot in it. I didn't mean to cause you offence," said Meg, flushing bright pink. "It's just I worry about my grandson, you know. I don't want him to be obsessed with computer games. And I would like him to learn to read. I read to him all the time, you know, and he absolutely loves the books I read him." "Oh, I'm sorry, Meg. Let you get on with your job. I don't want to hold you up. I now need to go and get that book," I said, nodding at her, while I pulled back the sliding doors and hurriedly slipped onto the porch. I could hear the whirling sound of the hoover as Meg resumed her impassioned cleaning. I have to give it to her. She really did make the house look like a new pin, and seemed to get something positive out of cleaning. Now, where on earth was that book? I ventured out onto the porch. A wind whipped against my face, rusting the fabric of the cotton dress I was wearing. I was suddenly aware of how nippy it was. I could feel the goose flesh developing on my bare arms. I'd need to put on a sweater when I got back to the house. My cold feet were not thanking me for being naked, and were silently begging me to put on a pair of woolly socks. Now, where was that book, I thought? I was sure I'd left it page side down on the Adirondack coffee table, but it was no longer there. But my glass I'd been drinking out of the previous night remained stoically in place, with the dregs of Coca-Cola at the bottom of the glass. But I knew I'd left my book here. I began to feel annoyingly frustrated, that exasperating feeling you tend to get when you cannot find something you're looking for. Indeed, I knew I had left that book on this table. That was odd, I wondered. Where could it have got to? Books didn't just have legs and run away. I definitely did not bring it back into the house, or did I? I began to second-guess myself. I glanced over the lake, inspecting the brooding sky. It really did look ominous out there.
It was almost as if someone had turned down the light very low on a dimmer switch. It looked more like early evening, when it slipped into night, but it was not even 10 o'clock in the morning yet. Meg was right. The clouds were choking with moisture, and it certainly wouldn't be long before they relinquished their heavy load onto the earth. I noticed that the wind was whipping up the water so that it rippled wildly, with the frenzied waves lapping against the beach. It really was quite dramatic. That was when my attention was drawn to a torn page of my book, caught up in some rambling foliage from an overhanging piece of shrubbery that unabashedly tumbled over the wooden balustrades of the porch. Confounded, I walked over to the bushy shrub, releasing the page from its leafy entanglement. How had a page of my book come undone, and where was the rest of the book? It then occurred to me that a blast of wind may have blown my book off the porch onto the beach, and if it blew any further, it might end up drowned in the water. I hurriedly darted down the steps of the wraparound porch, horrified to see that torn-out pages of my book were being rolled across the beachy sand. Someone had torn up my book. I hurriedly dashed towards the pages of the book to retrieve them. They were being swept away by the wind. That was when I saw Meg's grandson Angus standing in the water of the lake, with it up to his ankles. He was grinning at me wildly and holding up the rest of my broken book that I was reading in his hands. He was tearing up the pages and tossing them at me with great acclaim. My first thought was that Meg's grandchild was a horrible little boy. He had torn up my book. This was crazy. Why would he do that? But more to the point, he was 5 years old, going on 6. He couldn't even swim, and was not allowed to go down to the lake. He could be swept away by the wind current and potentially drown in the angry water that had been galvanized by the wind. My emotions seesawed between anger and dismay, and the little boy tearing up my book was not a pleasing sight to see. Why had Meg not been looking after him properly, I wondered. She had promised she'd keep a beady eye on him. He must have slipped out of the house clandestinely when she wasn't looking. If anything bad happened to the boy, Meg would never forgive herself. "Angus, get out of the water now! It's dangerous in there! You could drown! And stop tearing up my book!" The boy just stared at me, giving me a huge grin. He ran mischievously into the water. If he went in any further, he would surely drown. What on earth was he doing? He was recklessly disobedient. "Angus!" I cried out again, with anger in my voice. "Get back here now! If you go into the water any further, I told you, you will drown! Do you understand?" The boy wantingly ignored me and got deeper into the water. Oh, my God! He turned around to look at me teasingly, and something strange about his eyes made me stop in my tracks. They had become so dark. Angus had blue eyes, and that's when I remembered the kushtaka. Was this Ottoman pretending to be Angus, I wondered? The thought consumed me with terror. This time my body was shaking like a leaf. But what if the boy was genuinely Angus? What if I was wrong? If I left him on his own, he could potentially drown, and every second counted. But if this was the kushtaka, I could be in grievous trouble. My life could be in jeopardy. What on earth should I do? I was torn between a rock and a hard place, and in a moment of cocky bravado I said, "I know exactly who you are. I'm not fooled by you in the slightest. You're not Angus. You're not a little boy. You're pretending to be one. You're the kushtaka. I can see it." The next thing I knew is that Angus was gone, and rising above the water in his place was a monstrous beast that for a second looked like a Bigfoot, only its coat was dense and shiny and sleek like an otter. It stood up like a man, with a long tail. It opened its mouth and growled at me. Fear seemed to pulverize my entire heart. But the creature dived down in the waves of the water and swam away. My blood went icy cold. That thing could have snatched me under the water and whisked me away to a watery grave. It had been so close, too close for comfort. What was even more weird was that when I returned to the wraparound porch, my book was lying half open on the table, as if it had always been there, and none of the pages were torn out or missing. And yet out there on the beach I had physically felt those pages in my own hand. All I can say was that this was mind acrobatics and a simulated manipulation of the likes that I have never seen before. As I entered the living room, Meg looked up at me, switching off the hoover. You took your time getting back. I thought you'd changed your mind and taken a stroll off onto the beach. She eyed the book in my hand quizzically. I said to her, Where's little Angus, your grandson? Oh, he's playing in the kitchen. He's such a sweet little boy, so well behaved. I put up the play fence for him, so he can't waddle away. You know what children are like. Sure enough, when I went into the kitchen, there was little Angus smiling at me. He was identical to the Angus projection I'd seen on the beach in the water, but only for a moment had his blue eyes turned a dark colour, as if I'd seen through a crack in the hologram. If I hadn't, I might not be here today to tell this story. It's been 5 years since that incident, and I still live here at Purple Rain with Iris, and we've started up our own business, making nougat and Turkish delight and all kinds of sweets, which we sell all over America. Our business is now booming. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. I told you it was amazing. I mean, goodness gracious, this kushtaka is something else. You know, being able to turn into anything so that you can think that someone is drowning in the water and you go after them and they pull you down. This kushtaka is a Machiavellian, masterful, artful creature.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.